matched with this woman on Bumble last spring, and to this day, I still don't know who I actually met that night. Her name on the app was Rachel. She looked normal in her pictures, nothing crazy or overly edited, just a cute brunette who worked in marketing and liked hiking. We talked for a few days, and she seemed down to earth. No weird messages or vibes. She didn't push for anything, and she actually wanted to go slow. Honestly, it felt refreshing compared to the other matches. After about a week of talking, we agreed to meet up for dinner on a Wednesday night. She picked a restaurant in a quiet part of town, a little nicer than the places I usually go, but nothing too crazy. When I got there, I texted her that I parked. She didn't answer. I waited at the entrance, checking my phone every couple minutes. 10 minutes went by, then 20. I thought maybe she got stuck in traffic. I messaged again, saying I was inside by the hostess stand. I started getting a little embarrassed. It looked like I was getting stood up. The hostess asked if I wanted a table, and I told her I was waiting for someone. She told me no one under the name Rachel had checked in. Now 30 minutes passed, and I was about to leave when a guy came in and walked straight up to me. He was maybe mid-40s, scruffy, kind of heavy, wearing a black hoodie. He asked me if I was Jake. My name wasn't on the reservation, so it caught me off guard. I told him yes, and he said he was Rachel's brother. He told me Rachel wasn't feeling well, but she still wanted to meet me, and she asked him to pick me up and bring me to their place since it was really close and she didn't want to cancel. The whole thing already sounded weird, and I asked why she didn't text me that. He said she tried, but her phone died, and she didn't really want to bail on our date. His tone was calm and polite, and he didn't seem aggressive or anything, but this was just a little off. I asked where she lived, and he said just a few blocks over, and that driving would be easier because the sidewalks were icy. I stood there debating it. A part of me felt like a jerk if I refused, like maybe she really was sick and embarrassed. But the other part of me felt like nothing about this was normal. I told him I was fine walking. I asked for the address. He said it would be better if he showed me. That's when something in my stomach told me not to go. I told him I'd rather reschedule, and I started walking toward the door. He stepped in front of me, not aggressively, but just enough to block my path. He said Rachel would be upset and that she specifically asked him to bring me. I told him I'd text her later. He stared at me for a few seconds, then stepped aside and said, "Have a good night," in a tone that sounded more like a warning than anything else. I left the restaurant fast and got into my car. I locked the doors immediately. As I pulled out of the parking space, I saw him standing outside the restaurant watching me. I drove away thinking that was the end of it, and maybe it was just some weird misunderstanding. Later that night, around 11 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a message on Bumble from Rachel's profile. It said, "Why didn't you come?" I replied that her brother came to the restaurant and told me she was sick. She answered instantly, saying she didn't have a brother. All I could think was, what? I told her exactly what happened, and she stopped responding. I figured maybe she was freaked out too. I tried to sleep after that, but around 1 a.m., I got a notification that someone was trying to log into my email, then my bank app, and then my Instagram, all within minutes of each other. I changed my passwords and turned on every security feature I could. I didn't quite connect it to Rachel's situation at first. The next morning, I checked Bumble to see if she had replied, but her profile was gone, completely deleted. Around noon, I got a text from an unknown number. It said, "You should have come with me." I showed the text to my roommate, and he told me to block the number and report it. I blocked it, but the messages didn't stop. New numbers kept texting me, different area codes. Each message was something short and vague, like, "We saw you, next time don't waste my time," and "You made it harder for yourself." At one point, a message came through that used my full name, not the name I used on Bumble, my real legal name. I didn't answer any of them. That night, while I was home alone, someone knocked on my apartment door. I was on the couch, and I could not move. After a minute of silence, there was another knock, harder this time. I thought about calling the police, but it had only been 2 knocks, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. The hallway was empty. I stepped back and waited, After a few seconds, I heard heavy footsteps walking down the stairs. The next day, I called the restaurant and asked if anyone matching that guy's description had a reservation or had checked in around the time I was there. They said no. I asked if anyone had been standing around outside looking in, maybe waiting for someone. The hostess told me one of their servers actually mentioned a man in a hoodie pacing back and forth outside for almost an hour before I arrived. She said they thought he was waiting for someone, but he never went inside until he walked directly up to me. I didn't tell her the rest. I felt sick thinking how long he had been watching the entrance. I reached out to the local police and gave them the number that had texted me first. They weren't able to trace it to anyone, and since no crime had technically been committed, according to them, they couldn't do much. I deleted Bumble, I changed my phone number, and I changed all my passwords. Things were quiet for about a week. Then, one night when I was taking the trash out behind my apartment building, I found a folded piece of paper shoved under the handle of the dumpster. It had my name on it. I opened it. Inside was a printed photo of me from the night of the supposed date. Me standing inside the restaurant lobby looking at my phone. The angle was from outside the window. Someone had watched me the entire time. On the back of the photo, it said, "You." I couldn't sleep for days. I started staying at friends' houses. Every little sound made my heart jump. A few days later, I checked the dumpster again and found nothing. I became really hyper-aware of my surroundings. Eventually, the messages and everything stopped, or maybe they just stopped showing themselves to me. Maybe they were still watching. The only thing I know is that the person I met that night was not Rachel's brother, because Rachel didn't exist. Someone made the entire profile from scratch. Someone created her just to lure somebody somewhere. Someone was expecting me to leave that restaurant with them. And the worst part is that I still don't know who he was. I have not been on a dating app since. I feel like I was supposed to disappear that night, and the only reason I didn't was because I trusted my gut at the last second. After turning 30 years old back in January, I started getting sick of being single. I hadn't been in a real relationship in several years, and I wanted to get back out there. I had always resisted online dating, but I eventually decided to bite the bullet and download the dating app Hinge. After a few days of using the app, I did end up with several matches, but none of them ever amounted to anything. One Monday night, I was chilling at home watching hockey when I got a phone notification from Hinge saying that I had matched with a girl named Rebecca. Her profile looked legit. She had a photo of herself at her job, a short video of her and her friends at a bar shooting darts, a picture of her at an outdoor concert, and a regular selfie of just her face. I thought she was very attractive, so I messaged her. Before long, we were having a nice conversation about our respective jobs and hobbies. She seemed cool and normal, so I asked her if she wanted to meet at a local arcade bar that Friday. She took a while to respond, something like 4 hours. At about 1 a.m., she finally got back to me and agreed to the date. After our plans were set, I didn't hear from her at all for 4 days, until literally 30 minutes before our date. She sent a text that just said, "On my way," at our agreed upon time. I pulled up to the bar and was immediately surprised by how slow the place looked. This was a Friday at 8 p.m., and this bar only had 2 cars in their parking lot. I pulled into a spot right by the front sign of the bar. Mere seconds after I put my car in park, I got a text from Rebecca saying that she was having car trouble and that she was parking on the other side of the bar. This immediately struck me as super suspicious, since the other side of the bar was nothing but a few dumpsters and a fence that separated the bar from the woods. It didn't make any sense how she would even end up back there. I tried calling her, but after one ring it went to voicemail. I hung up and immediately received another text from her that said, "Please just come around back and help with my car." Alarms were going off in my head, but I wasn't immediately sure what to do. I sent her a text that just said, "This doesn't feel right, I'm leaving." I know that sounds a little dumb in retrospect, but I was seriously unsure of how to handle the situation. After sending her the text, I put my car in reverse and started leaving the parking lot. As soon as I was about to turn off the lot, 2 men in ski masks came running out from behind the bar straight towards my car. They didn't appear to be holding any kind of weapon, but I was definitely not going to wait around any longer to find out. I sped off all the way back to my apartment. Once I got back home, I noticed that there was a big dent on the top of my car's trunk, as if one of the guys had thrown a large rock at my car as I was speeding off. I didn't even notice a heavy object hitting my car. That's how scared I was in the moment. I called the police and told them the whole story, but at the end of the day, there wasn't much they could really do. They said they would keep me posted if any leads came up, whatever that means, but I haven't heard back from them. Weirdly, this didn't totally scare me off dating apps, since I figured the odds of that happening again are very slim. Still, I'm much more careful about meeting people off of them, and I make sure to call or FaceTime women before meeting them. I still remember that stretch of 2024 like it was yesterday. Humid city nights, cramped condo living, and the constant hum of anxiety sitting in my chest because the board exam was only a few months away. I was staying in a small condominium in the city with my 3 friends. All of us were buried in review materials, practice exams, and the occasional emotional breakdown disguised as a coffee break. And like every other stressed out 20-something stuck between obligation and burnout, I thought it would be a great idea to distract myself with someone new. That's when I met him. Let's call him Michael. I don't know if it was the boredom, the loneliness, or just the fact that I was tired of thinking about formulas, but I found him attractive right away. He was charming in the beginning. Calm, funny, the type of guy who replied fast, but not too fast. It was as if he mastered the perfect balance of interest and chill. We started talking every day, and then every night. And before I could fully process what I was doing, we were dating, or at least something that felt like dating. Michael was, at first, everything a sane person would want. Respectful, attentive, a good conversationalist. We would be on calls for hours while I lay on my thin condo mattress, staring at the ceiling and listening to his voice fill the room. The only weird thing was that he never showed his face during our calls. He claimed his phone had been stolen and the laptop he was using didn't have a functioning camera. I didn't question it at first, but slowly, little red flags began popping up like notifications I kept swiping away. The biggest one? The way his tone changed whenever the topic got even remotely intimate. Out of nowhere, this man would ask me for explicit selfies every single time. I shut it down firmly every time. I wasn't comfortable with that, especially online. I told him that straight, but it was like talking to a dog in heat. No, scratch that. A dog in heat at least has the excuse of being an animal. This guy, he was worse, because he knew exactly what he was doing. We'd argue about it, a lot. He'd push, I'd refuse, and he'd sulk. Sometimes he'd apologize, sometimes he'd respect my boundaries, only to ask again the next day like we didn't just fight about the same thing. The cycle became exhausting, and yet, despite all of that, I still wanted to meet him in person, to see if this connection was real or if I was just romanticizing a voice on the other end of a screen. But every time, and I mean every time I suggested meeting up, he had an excuse. He had errands, he was busy, he didn't feel well, his schedule was full, he wasn't in the city, he had a family thing, he had an emergency, or the classic, soon. It was always soon. But soon never came, and somewhere between the late night calls, the excuses, the constant sexual pressure, and the growing pit in my stomach, something in me began to shift. Something wasn't right with Michael, and I felt it, long before I admitted it. My friends had been warning me for weeks. Every time Michael dodged a meetup, every time he gave some vague excuse about his broken camera, every time he pushed for explicit photos but refused to show so much as half his face, my friends would exchange looks. Does he not show himself on video call at all? One of them asked one night while we were reviewing in the living room. Not even a quick flash of his face? Another added. I shrugged. His phone got stolen, I reminded them for maybe the 10th time that month, and his laptop camera is broken. They stared at me like I had just announced I believed in unicorns. Marie, come on, one of them said gently. If he really wanted to see you, he would find a way. Even a 10-year-old laptop has a camera. Something's off. I knew they were right. Deep down, I felt it too. But I kept defending him. I kept telling myself he wouldn't call me every day if he wasn't serious. I kept insisting he was just going through something personal. I kept believing the version of the person he pretended to be. Then came December, weeks before Christmas, with that stupid mix of hope and denial swirling in my chest. I finally told him, "Come over, meet my family, spend Christmas with us." He sounded thrilled. He said yes instantly, no hesitation or excuses. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe everything would pay off in the end. I pictured a sweet Christmas morning introduction, a cheesy meet my boyfriend moment, a fresh start, maybe even something real. But the day before our meetup, everything shattered. I remember sitting on the condo couch reviewing flashcards when he called me. His breathing was shaky and uneven. At first I thought he was just stressed. Then I realized he was crying. "Can we talk?" he whispered. Something in me went cold. It took a while for him to choke it out, but when he finally did, the words hit me like a punch straight to the stomach. "I'm a catfish." My heart dropped. He confessed everything. The photos, fake, taken from an Indonesian influencer he'd been pretending to be. His name, fake. His work, fake. His nationality, he lied about everything. My head was spinning so hard, I thought I would throw up. I felt my skin crawl and my face drain of color. It was like he peeled off a mask I didn't even know he was wearing. And then, because apparently the universe wanted the moment to be even worse, he sent me a picture of his real face. He claimed he didn't lie about being 24, but honestly, I've seen uncles in their late 30s who looked younger than him. In that moment, my brain connected all the dots. The way he pushed for explicit photos, the way he'd get sulky and aggressive when I refused, the way he'd avoid meeting up. Knowing what he really looked like, what he really was, made all his past behavior 10 times more uncomfortable. When I told him I wanted to break up, he snapped. He said, "So you're just like the other girls. You only liked me because of the pictures of the guy I used. You never cared about me. You're no different." I was stunned. He lied to me, deceived me, manipulated me, yet somehow I became the villain. He ranted and I cried. He blamed me, then he apologized, and then he begged. He guilt-tripped, like a full cycle of emotional manipulation condensed into 30 minutes. And then came the most unhinged part of it all. He said, "Please just let me stay with your family on Christmas. I already told my parents I won't be home. I have nowhere else to go." I stared at my phone in disbelief. Absolutely not. I muted him. I ignored every message, blocked the numbers, refused to let his chaos bleed into my holiday. And I had a peaceful Christmas with my family, the kind of Christmas I needed. But if things had truly ended there, I wouldn't be writing this. Because Michael didn't stay gone. He didn't accept the breakup. He didn't disappear quietly. And the worst part was still coming. For almost a year, life felt normal again. I focused on myself, my hobbies, and my friends. I became active on Instagram again, something I had stopped doing while dealing with the emotional fallout of Michael's lies. I started posting selfies, little life updates, even some cosplay photos I was proud of. It felt good to exist online without feeling watched. But the one thing I forgot? Michael and I still followed each other. It didn't even cross my mind until it was too late. One night, after posting a few stories, nothing dramatic, just a selfie and a behind the scenes of a new cosplay, I got a notification. One message request, Michael. He replied to my story, "Hey, how have you been?" Just reading his name made something cold crawl up my spine. I didn't open the message. I didn't even breathe for a second. I just locked my phone and tossed it aside, like the words would burn me if I looked at them for too long. I tried to ignore it, but the notifications kept coming. Every few hours, another message. Eventually, I got so sick of it. I opened our chat, and the moment I did, my entire body went cold. Because sitting there, sent just minutes earlier, was a photo of the front of our house. My parents weren't home. I felt like the air was being sucked out of my lungs. My fingers moved on instinct. I locked all the doors in the house, ran upstairs, shut my bedroom door, and locked that too. Then I called the police. While I was on the phone, trying to speak without my voice cracking, I heard knocking. Pounding. He was outside, and yelling my name. He yelled, "Please just open the door. We can talk." His voice was desperate and unhinged, a tone I had never heard before. I held my phone so tightly I thought it might crack. I crouched beside my bed, trying not to make a sound while the dispatcher kept me calm, step by step. "We're on the way. Don't come out. Stay on the line." It felt like hours, even though it was probably just minutes. Thankfully, we lived close to a police station. I heard footsteps outside, an officer shouting, and then finally, silence. They arrested him. When they came to the door to check on me, I finally unlocked it, still shaking. The officer who talked to me had a serious look on his face. The officer told me he was holding a knife. I had to grip the doorframe to stay upright. He came to my house with a knife. I didn't know if he meant to threaten me, or hurt himself, but none of the possibilities made me feel any better. They were all terrifying. Because of that, I had no choice but to tell my parents everything, every lie he told, and every red flag I ignored. They scolded me, of course, for trusting someone online and for hiding it from them, but underneath the worry and anger, they were relieved that I was alive. My mom hugged me like I came home from war. Thinking back on the words, "he was holding a knife," still give me the chills. I've never been a big dating app guy. Maybe a little bit in college, but mostly Tinder when I was messing around. After that, I had a 4-year relationship. I didn't really know how to go out and flirt anymore. I didn't really have game anymore. So I was on Tinder for a bit, just testing the waters as a freshly single guy for a bit, and going out with my single friends a lot. But when it came time to start seriously dating again, the easy answer was of course a serious dating app. Hinge was the one everyone recommended for finding quality women looking to actually date. So I got on there, and I got a few matches in the first few days. One was a really pretty girl named Jenna. She was this short Italian-looking girl with black hair, tan skin, and she looked like she worked out. We seemed to hit it off immediately in the chat. After like 10 messages from both sides, she asked for my Instagram, saying she hates opening the Hinge app and would rather talk there. So I gave it to her, and moments later, I got a follow request from her account. Her username was JennaX1 with 3 A's or something like that. She had like 2,000 followers, she followed 200 people, and she had 2 posts. Both posts were her taking a selfie in the mirror, but she admittedly looked good. The posts got a lot of likes and comments, all thirsty looking guys by the looks of it though. She had a story up and I clicked on it, and it was her at the gym taking a mirror selfie. Also looked good. She DM'd me right away, and we took the conversation from there. We continued talking about the same stuff we left off at, the gym, traveling, and we found that we related pretty well, and surprisingly, we agreed to meet for a spontaneous drink at a bar in town that night. She said she was in the same town as me, which was convenient, so we planned for 9 p.m. I knew the bar we were going to quite well, and I kinda knew the bartenders, so I decided to go a little early. The bar was slightly busy, but there were open bar stools at the bar, so I sat at one seated away from people. It was like 8:50. The usual bartender came over and greeted me, and she gave me an espresso martini. I casually took some sips and DM'd Jenna that I was there, but that she can take her time. Then I went through her profile a little more. I went to her tagged pictures. There were none. I went through the comments again, and there truly was not a single comment from a female. It was all dudes. I hoped that wasn't a red flag that she got around. Then, around this time, a man sat down on the bar stool next to me and greeted me saying, "How you doing?" and I nodded with a smile. I went back to looking at my phone, but the man next to me continued to engage in conversation. He asked if I come to this bar often because he recognized me. This is when I took a closer look at him. He was maybe like 38, just slightly gray, kind of overweight, and a patchy beard that he definitely should have shaved. I didn't recognize him at all though. I told him, yeah, I come here once in a while. He then reached out his hand for a handshake and introduced himself as Rob. Oh brother, I thought to myself. I wasn't in the mood for this. But I shook his hand and introduced myself as well. Around now, the bartender came over and said, "Finally decided to get a drink, I see," to this guy. He gave a weird, subtle laugh, but that kind of made me think for a bit. Was he already here, and he just came up to the bar to talk to me? I DM'd Jenna again, saying,
"Help me, this weird guy I think is hitting on me," as a joke. But I realized my previous DM to her was left unseen. I asked her if she was on her way. Then I went back to looking at her profile, and I decided to check her following list. And I realized she didn't follow a single female, only dudes. What kind of girl doesn't follow any of her girlfriends? This was weird. Was I catfished? The annoying guy to my right kept trying to talk to me. I had to tell him 1 second, please, as I tried calling Jenna through Instagram. She didn't pick up. It was past 9 o'clock, and it seemed like she was ghosting me, and I also just felt like this profile was fake now. I went to Hinge to find that her profile was gone, like I expected. Yup, I got catfished. I asked the bartender for the check, and then the Rob guy said, "Leaving already? Where are you from?" I said, "Yeah, I gotta get going." I didn't care to explain the situation to this guy. To be honest, I was kind of annoyed at how outwardly he went out of his way to talk to me. As I got the check, this guy would still keep trying to talk to me, even telling me I should stick around and that the hot chicks come around this time. I thought he was weird, and I was kind of just being short with him at this point. I may sound like a douche, but if you met the guy and experienced the way he approached, you'd have been annoyed too. As I said bye to the bartender and turned to leave, I felt a tight grip on my left wrist suddenly. I turned to see the man had his hand wrapped around my wrist. I said, "What the fuck are you doing?" loud enough for other people to notice and turn their heads. He started whispering to me and making a weird face. He said, "I'm Jenna. I'm sorry. Please don't go." I felt disgusting, like I needed to take a shower. I felt like throwing up. I felt violated. I broke free of his grip and hurried out of the bar to my car. It was a quiet drive home. I didn't play music. I didn't call anyone because I was still taking it in, and it felt embarrassing. When I got home, I collapsed into bed and stared at the ceiling for a bit, just absorbing what happened. I went to Instagram to go block the Jenna account, but it appeared he already blocked me, or he disabled the Instagram account entirely. This quickly became an experience I just wanted to put behind me. I turned on the TV and just tried to move on. I'd tell people tomorrow. And after I turned off the light is the part that made me hate having a bedroom on the first floor. There was an aggressively loud bang on my window. The blinds were closed and I couldn't see to the other side. Instead of yelling "Who's there?" I decided to stay quiet. I watched the blinds in horror, and then there was a voice on the other side, a man's voice saying my name, Scott, over and over again. I refused to acknowledge it, but he knew I was in there. He could see the light of the TV. He might have followed me without me realizing. He just kept saying Scott. He had to have said it like 10 times before it stopped. I stayed in my bedroom the rest of the night, and the next morning, I lifted the blind to see this. A note on the other side of the glass, saying, "I'll be watching you." I didn't leave my apartment the rest of the weekend. I moved a few days later. I remember this night like it was yesterday, even though I'm 26 now, and it happened when I was 12. My parents left me home with my 18-year-old brother Zach for the night, and at first I was excited because it was just me in the big house, which felt like huge freedom at the time. Zach told me he was going out for a few hours with friends and made me promise not to tell mom and dad, which I agreed to because I trusted him, and also why wouldn't I want the place to myself? He would get in huge trouble if my parents were to find out, and he knew that. At first, I thought it would be fun to be alone, especially on a weekend night. I ended up in the den where I decided to watch a scary movie. At that age, while home alone, not the best idea, which I learned the hard way. I had never been home alone for this long before, especially at night, and honestly, halfway through the movie, I started getting scared. Not entirely because of the movie itself, but because of the way the house sounded. The random creaks in the floor, the wind brushing against the windows, even the fridge clicking on periodically. Every time the movie made a loud sound, I would flinch, and I would look over my shoulder to behind the couch to the half flight of stairs that led to the main floor, expecting to see someone there.
Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, and I didn't know why I was subjecting myself to scaring the crap out of myself. I turned off the TV and ran upstairs to my room like a scared little kid running from imaginary demons that follow you the second you turn off the lights. When I got to my room, I went into the bathroom that connected both to my room and my parents' bedroom, where I brushed my teeth as fast as I could and tried to calm down. After that, I went into my room to play Call of Duty Zombies on my Xbox 360, thinking it would make me a little less scared. I played for a few hours, losing track of time and focusing on the game. Eventually, my team and I died on zombies, and I got frustrated. I decided it was late and I should go to sleep though. Not long after that point, I felt the vibration of the front door closing, and I assumed it was Zach coming back. I lay there awake, listening to the sounds of my brother moving around downstairs. Which was odd, because usually when he'd get home, he'd go right upstairs to his room. But there were weird sounds coming from downstairs for too long, where it started getting unusual. They were subtle, little footsteps or indescribable thumps and thuds. I felt my stomach start churning a little. That stupid idea to watch that scary movie was really getting to me. I got up and went to the window to look outside, expecting to see Zach's car in the driveway where he usually parked, but it wasn't there. That's when the real panic set in. I had no cell phone at the time, I was only 12, so I had no way to contact my parents or Zach without leaving the bedroom and going to one of the house phones, which felt impossible at that moment. I quietly tiptoed to my bedroom door to confirm that it was locked, knowing that the lock could be unlocked from the other side with just a fingernail. I knew that if someone wanted to get in, they easily could. I looked around and decided the only safe place to hide was the small crawl-in closet built into the wall of my room. I squeezed inside, shut the door carefully from the inside, and tried to calm myself as I listened. It was at this point that I vividly remember hoping that I was just being overly paranoid and that it actually was Zach. Maybe he parked on the side of the house instead. Seconds later, I heard someone fumbling with the door, trying to get in. And then moments later, the door opened. The person was inside my room, and I had no idea who it was or what they wanted. I stayed completely still, listening to footsteps moving around my room, feeling the floorboards creak beneath the weight of someone walking, and hearing things being moved and shifted around. Every second felt like an eternity. I was terrified that the closet door could open at any second and I could be dead. I still prayed it was my brother, but I stayed quiet, barely breathing and hoping that whoever it was would leave. I could hear them dragging something across the floor at one point, which made me even more nervous. I felt like hours had passed, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, I heard footsteps receding and moving away from my room. I stayed in the closet for what seemed like forever, likely 2 hours, until finally, I heard Zach calling my name from across the house. His voice sounded urgent and pissed off, and a few moments later, he came into my room and called my name again. I stepped out of the closet, and the first thing he did was yell at me, asking what I was doing in there and what I had done to his room. It was this moment that confirmed to me that it was in fact not my brother who was in the house. I explained the situation as quickly as I could, still shaking and unable to stop my hands from trembling. Once he understood, we both got up and started looking around the house together. That's when we realized how bad it really was. Drawers had been pulled out, some of our electronics were missing, including TVs and gaming consoles. It was clear someone had been through the house and had taken things that were valuable. Zach immediately called the police, knowing that this was serious, and we waited together, still on edge, checking doors and windows to make sure nothing else was taken. The police came and made a report, writing down everything that was missing and asking us questions about what happened. They told us they would investigate and that we should wait for our parents to get home. Around 4 a.m., our parents arrived. My dad was furious and went straight for Zach, smacking him square in the face for being such a careless idiot, not only leaving me alone, but leaving the front door unlocked. My mom checked on me, gave me a hug, and told me she was just glad I was safe. Zach was forced to pay monthly rent from that point on to slowly pay back for all the things that were stolen and treated with extreme caution after that night. I, on the other hand, was not punished at all. I was just shaken up, terrified of what had happened, and the whole experience stuck with me for years. Every time I thought about it, I could feel the fear all over again, remembering hiding in that closet and hearing someone walking around my room, not knowing if I would make it out alive. It was by far the scariest experience of my life, and it has stayed with me even now. When I was just a child, not even in kindergarten, I lived with my grandparents. My mom and dad had just separated, and my dad worked in the next town over, so I saw him every weekend. My uncle, my dad's brother, also lived with us, so I was rarely ever truly alone. I was always told to never answer the door for strangers. It was a small, peaceful town where everyone knew each other. We had a neighbor who visited often to watch hockey, wrestling, or join family barbecues. I'll call him David. He was friendly with both my grandpa and my uncle. He often drank beers with my uncle and helped my grandpa with yard work or truck repairs. If my grandpa came home with a moose from hunting, he and David would haul it into the shed together. One night, I was briefly left home alone. My grandma was at bingo and had called for a pickup. My grandpa told me he was going to get her and asked if I wanted to come. I refused because I was watching cartoons. He reminded me not to open the door for strangers, then he left. As soon as I saw the truck pull away, the house got quiet. Only a few minutes later, someone knocked at the door. I ran up and asked aloud who it was, and I just heard David's familiar voice identifying himself. I told him that my grandparents weren't home, and he replied that he had just seen my grandpa leaving. I told him my uncle wasn't home either, and he said he had been talking to my uncle on the phone and knew he was out drinking at a friend's place. Then he asked to come in. I told him I wasn't allowed to open the door for strangers, and he insisted he wasn't a stranger since he was our neighbor and someone I already know. In my child mind, he was right, but I didn't understand why he would come over when my grandpa and uncle weren't there. I unlocked the door and opened it. David towered over me. He was obviously drunk, swaying, slurring, squinting with one eye. He stepped inside and put his hands on my shoulders as I backed up. I didn't feel alarmed yet because I had seen my uncle drunk many times. I told him he could wait in the kitchen while I went back to watch TV, but he would not let go of my shoulders. I tried to pull his hands off of me, but couldn't. His voice changed, filled with anger, and he said things that frightened me, though I can't remember the exact words now, only the fear that they put in me. He dragged me into the kitchen and grabbed a large knife. He pressed the tip against my belly and asked if I wanted to be stabbed. When I cried, he told me to quiet down or he would cut my tongue or slit my throat. He dragged the dull side of the blade across my throat to show he was serious. Then I heard my grandparents' truck pulling in. Car doors closed outside. Relief flooded me, and I was about to scream for help, but David clamped his hand over my mouth. He turned us both toward the doorway just as my grandma entered. Her smile vanished when she saw him holding me with a knife. She screamed for my grandpa to get inside immediately. My grandpa rushed in, yelling in shock and fury as he demanded to know what was happening. He took one look at David holding me hostage and charged forward, shouting at David with pure rage. David shoved me to the floor. My grandma rushed over, grabbed me tightly, and blocked me from seeing what was happening while telling me I was safe. I could still hear the struggle. Eventually, my grandpa overpowered him. When I finally looked up, my grandpa was shoving David out the door, yelling at him to never come back, and then slamming the door. As I grew up, I realized David had waited deliberately. He must have known my uncle wasn't home and that my grandma was at bingo. He had seen my grandpa leave. That was his moment. I was too young to understand his intentions. Years later, after my grandpa's funeral, when I was sitting with my grandma discussing memories, I brought up that night and how heroic grandpa had been. She looked uneasy. She said it was truly a terrifying night. She asked if I remembered that my grandpa went out hunting that same night. I faintly remembered him leaving, even though hunting at night wasn't something he usually did unless it involved camping. When I asked why he left, she claimed she didn't remember much. It got me thinking. They never called the cops to press charges on him. and I never saw him again after that night. My grandpa was respected in the community. He was friends with, as well as went to the same church as some police officers, and was known to be a good hunter. No one would ever question if they saw a bloody tarp in the back of his truck, and he was driving out of town late at night. This story happened a few years ago during spring break in 2020 when I was 15. I was home alone one night while my parents were out of town. I was just hanging out in my room when I got a call from one of my mutual friends from school, who I'll refer to as Mason. I don't usually get calls from Mason, let alone texts or keep in touch with him, but I answered anyway. Before I could get a word out, he asked what I was doing. I told him I was just at home and wasn't up to anything. He then asked if he could drop off one of my buddies because he needed a place to stay for the night. This buddy of mine is someone I've known since 3rd grade, who I'll refer to as Neil. I basically told him I didn't feel like having company over and just wanted to chill by myself. After hearing this, Mason practically begged me to let Neil stay at my house. I could sense desperation in his voice as he pleaded with me to let him drop Neil off. I was still reluctant at first, but then Mason told me he'd let me use his weed pen if I let him drop off Neil. After he said that, I caved and told him they could pull up. Looking back, I realized how dumb I was to let something like that persuade me, considering what happened next, but I was a stupid pothead at the time, so what can you do? Neil has always been very outgoing, almost with zero filter, and he doesn't care what others think about him. So when I heard from my brother and other friends the week prior that he had started acting really weird in his classes, I didn't think much of it at first. I asked my brother to elaborate, and he told me that Neil would sometimes start laughing or clapping out of nowhere, even if the classroom was completely silent, and he would sometimes say very strange things to people for no reason, like claiming the basketball coaches were Freemasons trying to convert him. After hearing this, I realized Neil wasn't acting normal, and it wasn't until he and Mason arrived at my house that I understood how bad it really was. I met Mason and Neil at my front door and greeted them like any other day. I hit Mason's weed pen as promised and gave it back. As Mason was about to leave, he grabbed Neil by the shoulders in a very serious way, tears forming in his eyes, and he pleaded with him not to do that thing. Neil looked at him blankly and casually responded that he understood. I really should have asked what was going on, but for some reason, I didn't, and I let Neil inside as Mason left. After I closed the front door, the first thing Neil asked me was whether all the doors in the house were locked. Red flags immediately went off in my head, and I knew I had just gotten into something bad. I told him they were locked and asked why. He asked me to check, so I led him down the narrow hallway by the front door to show that the back and laundry room doors were both locked. He didn't say anything after I confirmed it, and we stood in silence for a few seconds. Then, out of nowhere, his hand shot up like he was raising it, and he put on this eerie, toothy smile that I can still see clearly in my mind. He held it for a few seconds before lowering his arm without saying a word. I forced a fake chuckle to make the situation seem less weird. Then, Neil asked for some water, so we went to the kitchen. As I grabbed bottles from the fridge, I noticed him lingering by the drawer with silverware, including the knives. I watched as he slowly opened the drawer and reached for a steak knife. Without thinking, I ran over, grabbed his hand before he could take it, and slammed the drawer shut. Neil didn't react or move. He just stared at me and let out a chuckle like he was pretending it was a joke. At that moment, I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, and I was frozen in fear. The kind of fear people describe in life or death situations. I had never felt like my life was in danger until that moment, and I could only focus on how I was going to get Neil out of my house. He finally broke the silence by suggesting we go to the park in the neighborhood. I agreed as if nothing happened. We walked to the laundry room leading to the driveway, and I intentionally let him out first. I told him I needed to put shoes on, which I did. He paused and subtly looked disappointed, telling me to hurry up. I shut the door, locked it immediately, and called my brother to explain what had just happened. After finishing the call, I grabbed every knife in the kitchen and brought them upstairs to my room. Keep in mind, I was stoned at the time, so my decision making wasn't perfect, but I knew I needed to prevent Neil from forcing his way back into the house. My brother arrived with 3 friends in less than 5 minutes, and they met Neil outside. I stayed inside for a few minutes, nervous, then went out. My brother and friends were talking to Neil, who was rambling about the school's basketball coaches being in the Illuminati and claiming they would sexually assault the boys on the team to make them play better. He continued talking nonsense for a few minutes, then we decided to get him home, because there was no way I was letting him stay under my roof after what had happened. One of my friends eventually took Neil home, even though he insisted he couldn't go because he believed his dad was going to kill him. After all of this, I called Mason to ask what Neil had said to him that made him act that way, and Mason explained that during the car ride, Neil had been reading a manifesto claiming he needed to kill himself or someone else to prevent his dad from trying to kill him. Mason had panicked and just wanted to get rid of Neil, which explains why he sounded so desperate to drop him off at my house earlier. After hearing this, I lost my mind and asked Mason why he would just dump Neil at my house without warning me, though I knew part of the fault was mine for not asking sooner. Later, it was revealed that Neil had taken drugs he shouldn't have, which triggered schizophrenic episodes and caused him to hear voices. About a month later, I told my mom the story, and she was not thrilled, to put it lightly. Needless to say, I avoided something truly horrific that night by being on edge when Neil entered the house, and I still think about what could have happened if I hadn't paid attention to him in the kitchen. I was 10 years old when this happened. My mom had gone grocery shopping that day, and she asked if I wanted to come. I remember making a big stink about not wanting to. It was a warm, sunny afternoon, and I just wanted to stay home and shoot hoops in the street. I told her nothing bad would happen, and she would only be gone for a couple of hours. She finally gave in and let me stay. As soon as she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed the old basketball from the garage and started shooting around in the street where we had a hoop set up. I shot around for a while, doing little games with myself, pretending I was down by 1 with a buzzer shot. I was sweating a little from running back and forth, and at one point I stopped to catch my breath. I bounced the ball lazily and looked around the neighborhood as I caught my breath. That's when I looked up toward the house. At the upstairs window, someone was staring down at me. It was only a shadow behind the glass at first, like someone was standing back from the sunlight. I stared for a good second or two before the shape shifted slightly, and I realized it wasn't some kind of trick from the sun. Someone was up there at the window, looking out at the street. None of my family was supposed to be home. My sister was at college, my dad was at work, and my mom was across town buying groceries. I dropped the basketball without meaning to. The window was my sister's room. The blinds were half open, and the figure was right behind them. I say figure because that's all I saw, no distinguishable features. I didn't know what else to do except run inside and see who was home. I ran around the side of the house and through the backyard gate. I burst inside and slammed it shut behind me. I yelled up the stairs asking who was home. My voice cracked when I yelled it. For a second, I didn't hear anything. Then a voice answered from upstairs. It said, "Brad, come upstairs." It wasn't my mom, it wasn't my sister, and it wasn't my dad. It was deeper than any of their voices, but not deep like a grown man trying to sound scary. It sounded like someone trying to sound normal. I didn't go anywhere near the stairs. I ran straight through the house, grabbed the house phone off the kitchen counter, and sprinted back outside as fast as I could. I called my mom and told her someone was in the house, and she didn't believe me at first. She told me that's not something to joke about, and she said that she was almost done shopping. But I started basically crying into the phone, telling her I wasn't joking, telling her I heard someone call my name from inside, and they're at the upstairs window. She finally believed me when I started sobbing and begging her to come home. She said she was leaving the store right now. After she hung up, she must have called the police, because a cop car pulled up at the same time my mom's car turned into the driveway. She ran to me asking where I saw the person. I pointed to the upstairs window. The police went in first. My mom followed them inside after a minute or two. I waited out front. I didn't want to go back in there. For 10 minutes, I just stood there, staring at the upstairs window. No one appeared at it again. Eventually, one of those officers came out and told me it was safe to come inside. I went in and pointed upstairs to the room where I saw the man. They checked the closets, under the bed, behind the dresser. They even checked the attic. They checked every room in the house. They didn't find anyone or anything. After the police left, my mom started acting doubtful again. She said she believed me, but I could tell she didn't fully. She said if she found out I was messing around, I'd be punished for scaring her and wasting the police's time. I kept telling her I wasn't lying. She kept saying she knew, but her voice said something else. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I kept thinking about the voice and that shadow behind the blinds. But eventually, I got tired enough to drift off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It was still dark out, and at first I thought I woke up from a bad dream. But then I heard something in my room, just loud enough to wake me. I sat upright in my bed. My eyes were still adjusting to the dark, but I could see the outlines of my room. I could see my dresser, my closet door cracked open, my shelves, and across the room, not far from my bed, I saw something else. An unfamiliar shape. A tall, dark shape, standing completely still. For a second, I thought I was imagining it, but then the slightest movement made me realize what it was. It was a person, a full-grown person standing in my bedroom. I didn't even have time to breathe. I just screamed, a loud, broken scream that tore out of my throat. As soon as I screamed, the figure moved, fast. It darted across my room in 2 steps, grabbed my window, slid it open, and jumped out. I heard the man's feet land on the small awning below the window. My parents burst into the room as soon as I screamed. My dad ran straight to the window and looked out. Then he ran downstairs and out the back door to try to find whoever it was. I'm fairly certain he ran out there barefoot. He came back a few minutes later out of breath. He kept shaking his head and saying he didn't see anyone. They called the police again, but that time it was mostly just to file another incident report and for the cops to scout the area. We don't know how long he was in the house. All I know is he was inside during the day, long enough to know my name, and he was watching me from my sister's window, and he stayed in the house until nightfall. That, or he snuck in and out of the house through my bedroom window by climbing up on that awning. Either way, he was in my room while I slept, standing there in the dark. Who knows what else he did while he was in the house? That's the scariest part. For the clarity of this story, I must mention that I have a hearing disability that has made me hard of hearing. I know that there are some things in life that I'll never understand, but I still look back on this experience wondering what could have happened and what I should have done differently. This all happened around a year ago. The holiday season had just rolled by and I was settling down from traveling and all the get-togethers with family and friends. I live in a small suburban neighborhood that borders a forest in southern Quebec. It's a quiet area, as most of the residents are familiar with each other, which I honestly kind of prefer as it adds a warmer atmosphere. Around winter, I like to take my dog Monty on walks in the local forest. He's a Rottweiler Husky mix, which is perfect for me since I enjoy going for runs from time to time. The forest has several trails, none of which are challenging for non-hikers. I remember it being an afternoon. I had just finished having a late lunch and decided to burn the calories on a walk with Monty. As usual, my dog goes ballistic when we turn the corner on my street towards the forest entrance. It was relatively cold for a February day. A fresh blanket of snow lined the paths overnight, creating this nearly blank canvas. As usual, I let my dog off the leash so he could run around. There were a few yellow patches along with some boot prints in the snow, which signaled to me that several people had already taken their dogs out earlier. Most people like to go on walks before noon since the sun tends to set around 4 p.m., so I didn't expect to see anybody out at that time. After walking for around 30 minutes, we came to a fork in the path. I noticed that one of the paths hadn't been walked yet, so feeling semi-adventurous, I decided to take it. I have a pretty concrete memory of the trails, so I knew exactly where I was going. The trail led to a clearing, which was great, since I wanted to check out the native birds with the binoculars I had gotten for Christmas. I remember scanning the surroundings until I saw a strange shape along the tree line in the distance. When I focused my binoculars, I saw a blue tarp and what looked to be a makeshift shelter. As curious as I was to check it out, it was getting dark, and I wanted to get home. Turning around, Monty and I started walking back. As usual, he ran up ahead, but something seemed off in his behavior. He was much more alert and was sniffing the trail more than he normally would from what I observed in the past. When I looked down at the trail, my eyes widened. There was a set of footprints in the snow, much larger than my own. I remember turning my boots over out of sheer confusion to compare them to the ones in the snow. The prints were different, which left me with even more questions. There were no other forks in the trail, so whoever took it had to have passed me at some point. I figured they must have passed me while I was using my binoculars. At the time, it seemed like the most logical explanation, so I tried not to overthink it. At this point, it was significantly darker outside, but I could still make out my surroundings. As we were walking back, Monty stopped abruptly and started barking relentlessly in my direction. As I turned around, that's when I saw him. There was a man, probably around 6'4", wearing charcoal-colored snow pants and a white camo jacket only about a meter away from me. He didn't make any movements towards me. He just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets. I didn't recognize him from anybody in the neighborhood, so I assumed he must have been a hiker or someone from out of town. He looked like he was muttering something to me, but I couldn't read his lips due to the lack of lighting and not knowing if he was speaking English or French, which are the two commonly spoken languages in Quebec. I felt like an idiot at that moment for not bringing my phone with me, so I ended up trying to communicate with him that I was hard of hearing and that it was getting late. I got back home around 4:30. By then, it was completely dark out. I remember following my standard night routine, not really thinking much about the encounter, but in the middle of the night, something happened that still shakes me to this day. I woke up to Monty licking my hand, which is something he usually does to get me out of bed in the morning. I tapped my phone to check the time, and to my surprise, it was 3 a.m. I noticed a message from my neighbor asking if everything was all right, which, if I'm being honest, confused me at first. The message was a few minutes old and asked if everything was all right since Monty had been barking like he was possessed. I looked up from my phone to see that Monty was no longer in my room. I walked downstairs to find him barking hysterically at the patio door. As I approached the door, I struggled to see anything with my vision still blurry. I tried to focus my eyes when the motion sensor light turned on. At that moment, my heart sank. The man from the forest was standing there in my backyard. I didn't think twice to process any more questions. I stepped away from the door and texted 911. I don't think I've ever texted 911 faster than I did that night. I ran up to my room with Monty and grabbed the machete from under my bed. I'm a shorter woman with a background in martial arts, but I know damn well that the best move in a fight is to not fight at all. I sat there in my room guarding Monty and myself until the police came. With my heart beating out of my chest, I sat opposite from the door with Monty by my side. It didn't last long until Monty sprang up and started barking violently at the bedroom door. My hands were sweating profusely as I watched a shadow cast in from underneath the door. The movement in front of the nightlight suggested the man was seconds from breaking into my room. Those had to be the longest minutes of my life, as I anticipated the door handle turning or the door completely breaking in. Luckily for me, it never did. When the police arrived, I explained everything to them while they searched the property. The glass on the patio was smashed completely, but besides that, nothing was missing and everything was still relatively the same. The police found the gate in my backyard open. It leads to the forest, which is where they believe the man disappeared to. I let them know about the shelter I saw in the woods the day before. I took Monty and some of my belongings to stay with a family friend for a few days while I got the patio door fixed. I never got a follow-up from the police after the incident, but ever since that day, I decided to stick to roads when walking my dog, not trying to think too much about the incident. My name is Emberlay, and I'm a 16-year-old girl who lives in Illinois with my younger sister Kate, who's 15. My dad works for a deforestation group about 30 minutes from our house. It was a normal morning on December 5th as my sister and I were getting ready to go out to the movies. We decided to go watch a somewhat new horror movie, Terrifier 3, which had some Christmas stuff included in it. We all knew it was 18 plus, but nobody paid much attention. Plus, we looked older than we were anyway. We made our way to the movies and easily got in thanks to our appearance. However, halfway through the film, as everyone was anticipating the next scene, my phone buzzed loudly enough for the whole theater to hear, which really killed everyone's vibe as they all turned toward me with annoyed looks. My sister and I scurried out until I tripped, which was embarrassing enough. After we exited the theater, I checked my phone to see who called me. It was my dad, but instead of calling back, I received a text message that said something like, "Hey, would you mind bringing me some lunch since the small cafe in the woods is shut today?" I looked over at Kate, and she looked at me confused, but neither of us second-guessed the message since it seemed normal. We arrived home, packed some food for him, and took my car downtown to the woods. I've always loved that place and never felt uneasy there because it was large and secluded. The scenery was amazing, with a hill that led down to a lake perfect for fishing and photos. After a while, Kate and I got out of the car and we walked down the path through the woods. I took out my phone to call my dad, but he didn't pick up. Confused, I looked over at Kate, who was just as confused as I was. Why wouldn't he respond when he just called us at the movies? I decided to message him instead, reminding him that we were at the woods to give him his lunch. After a few moments, I saw the 3 little dots on the screen appear, showing he was typing. He responded by telling us to walk down the small hill and wait for him at the lake, which we followed. The sun was slowly setting since it was winter, so sunset came much earlier. The sky had a beautiful radiant orange glow over the hill and down the mountain. Snapping out of my thoughts, Kate pointed down to the lake where a man in black was sitting on the deck by the water with his back to us. We guessed it was our dad. We walked down a bit more and stopped a little behind him. I called out his name, but he didn't move. Kate grew uneasy, and her attitude made the scene even more eerie. I slowly pulled off the hood he was wearing and revealed a man who definitely wasn't our dad. Kate and I shrieked as he turned around and began waving my dad's phone around like a maniac, smiling like he was happy to see us scared. I blurted out asking why he was using our dad's phone, but he didn't respond. Instead, he lunged and grabbed Kate's arm as she screamed. Luckily, I was strong enough to pull her away, and we started running as fast as we could. The adrenaline pushed through us so much that I had never seen either of us run that fast. Behind me, I heard stomps getting closer, so I knew we were being chased. I didn't dare to turn around. Finally, we reached the car. I slammed the door shut and locked it as the man came to my window, then crouched down out of sight as I reversed and sped away back home. When we got home, my dad and mom were there. We arrived panting out of breath and explained the whole situation to them. My dad was furious and said his phone had been stolen while he was working, so he decided to come back home. He said the man must have taken his phone and messaged us. My dad called the police and filed the report. They used the IMEI number to track the device, which was still on the deck by the lake, and they returned the phone to my dad. They said there wasn't much they could do since the phone was already found. I thought this was the end of it, but I wouldn't be telling this if it was. 6 hours later, around 1 a.m., I got an unknown message that said, "I like that your house is lit only by your bedroom TV." I immediately went cold and pale. I paused the TV and heard rustling outside my window. My room was on the 2nd floor. I shut my phone and listened. Slowly, I peeked through the blinds and saw the man smiling with a gun pointed at my window. I screamed and pulled away as glass shattered everywhere across my room. My parents ran in, followed by Kate. I screamed for them to crouch and told them the man was outside with a gun. When my dad went to check, the man was gone. Then we heard another loud bang and more glass breaking downstairs in the kitchen. We ran and locked the bedroom as Kate called 911. My mom hugged us as we cried in fear. Throughout the whole situation, I kept wondering how he knew where we lived. A few moments later, the police arrived and searched the whole house, but nobody was there. Kate and I explained the situation again, and one of the officers said they should check the car. Surprisingly, a small air tag was found on my tire, which explained how the man knew where we lived and why he crouched before I sped out of the woods. The police told us they would patrol the streets and do everything they could to find the man. A few months later, he still hadn't been found, but he never returned, which I hope it stays that way. Me, Kate, and my parents are still traumatized by the situation, but mostly I felt stupid as the older sister for not being alarmed when the person didn't respond to calls and only responded through texts. All I know is that I'll be more careful and never go to secluded places again, especially when I'm responsible for someone else's safety. It was 2021. One word to describe my day: hectic. Work was a shit show. This was prime COVID time, so I was working from home. I was supposed to be meeting with my extended family upstate, and I ended up finally getting off a nearly 3-hour Zoom meeting for work a whole hour and a half after everyone else had already arrived at my parents' house. And that didn't include the next 2 hours or so the trek up to their house would take me. I filled up 2 cups of coffee in my kitchen to take with me before leaving. God knew I'd need them. The second I opened my front door, I realized this drive would be more of a shit show than I had originally thought. The snow and wind had already picked up since earlier that evening, and the streets were barely even plowed. The ground had at least 2 feet of snow already, and it was supposed to snow like this for a majority of the night. I had to be driving under 25 on most residential roads. My car at the time was also a really old, crappy Hyundai, which wasn't ideal for extreme weather conditions at all. It didn't have anti-lock brakes either. I'm a fast driver though, so when I got on the highway, I raised my speed to 70, which was probably a lot faster than safe for the conditions. I finally arrived at my parents' house around 9. They had begun dinner without me, but thankfully weren't too far along. A few drinks and gift sharing later, I started to lose track of time. I got so caught up in seeing my relatives I hadn't spoken to in a while that I ended up basically forgetting I still have to drive home, even as most of my family had started to leave. Once I finally got in my car to leave, it was past midnight, and at least another foot of snow had accumulated on the ground. I was buzzed, but I figured I was sober enough to drive home. Not that I condone drinking and driving at all. I was tired and simply wanted to get home. As I was heading towards the highway, I realized the roads were completely dead. I made the grave mistake of raising my speed to 40 down one particular road, because as I began to approach a bend in the road, I realized my car had gone into a skid. I tried not to panic, as this wasn't the first time I'd skidded. I started to steer into the skid and downshifted, but as I got even closer to the curve, and my car still wasn't slowing down, I started to panic. My car went straight off the side of the road and into a tree, and the airbag deployed. I was momentarily in shock from the force of the impact, but thankfully, I was relatively unscathed. My car was ruined though. The whole hood was buried in a bank of snow surrounding the tree I hit. No chance I was pushing it back onto the road or anything like that. The first thing I did was phone my roadside assistance company, and they said they'd send a truck to my location, but because of the horrible conditions, it could take up to 40 minutes for the truck to reach me. I was on a deserted road surrounded by forest and no houses for miles in either direction, so I decided to also call my parents and ask one of them to drive over and wait with me. My dad said he'd get in his car and drive over, so then I hung up and waited. As I was sitting there, I began to hear something over the sound of the wind howling outside. There were undeniably footsteps in the snow. I couldn't tell exactly from where, but they sounded somewhat distant. I opened the driver's side door and stepped out, looking over the roof of my car. I wasn't hearing footsteps anymore. Instead, I was hearing some new sounds. It was kind of hard to describe, but it sounded like some kind of wet slurping. I looked over to where I thought the sound was coming from, and I could see some movement by the tree line. It was dark as hell though, but I was pretty certain I was looking at a person. I called out, "Hello?" The sound stopped, but no one called back. I sat there for a few more seconds awkwardly, but no one ever responded or appeared to me. I couldn't see any more movement either. I was officially freaked out, so I got back in my car and locked the doors. What couldn't have been a whole minute later, I heard footsteps in the snow again outside. Then I heard something hitting the passenger side window, like a rock or something was thrown at it. I couldn't see out the passenger side window because it was covered in snow, or any of the windows for that matter. Once again, I opened the driver's side door and stepped out of my car. Checking my immediate surroundings, I made a disturbing discovery. There were boot prints in the snow, circling all around my car, and then leading away from my passenger side door into the woods. I felt sick to my stomach. I also noticed there were drops of blood in the snow. I opened my driver's side door and then grabbed my 9mm out of the glove compartment. Clutching it in my right hand, I began to follow the prints leading into the woods. At that moment, I was convinced someone out there was with me. As I followed the prints, the drops of blood began to grow larger. It looked like someone had been bleeding profusely. And then, I saw some dark mass lying in the snow just past the tree line. I couldn't tell what it was. I was just praying it wasn't a person. I took out my phone and enabled the flashlight. It wasn't a person. It was a dead deer, seemingly slaughtered by some larger, predatory animal. The stomach was ripped completely open, and shockingly, the deer had been completely decapitated. I swept the flashlight over the surrounding few feet, but I didn't see the head anywhere. I decided this was getting too weird for me, and I started heading back to my car. I got back to my car and opened the driver's side door, and as soon as I did, it was all I could do to keep myself from vomiting on the spot. Lying in the driver's side seat of my car was the severed head of a deer, placed on the seat as if it was looking right at me. I booked it out of there and made it a few minutes down the road before headlights appeared in the distance. I ran towards the car, waving my hands and shouting like a madman, still holding my handgun. Thankfully, it was my dad, and he stopped the car and asked me what the hell I was doing. I got in the passenger seat and explained everything to him, and I kid you not, he literally didn't believe me. I felt more comfortable going back to my car with my dad now, so he drove the two of us over there and we got out. The footprints were still all around my car, but the deer head was gone. All that remained was a large spot of blood on my driver's side seat. I think once my dad saw that, he started to believe me. The deer corpse was also gone. All that remained were drag marks in the snow. The tow truck finally showed up and he towed my car. My dad asked me if I wanted to call the police, but honestly, I just didn't have the energy to file a police report. I was exhausted and just wanted to go to sleep. I figured calling the police wouldn't accomplish jack anyways. So that's my story. I have no idea who was in the woods that night and what they wanted. Maybe they were just trying to scare me, or maybe they had worse intentions. When I was a kid, the attic always scared me more than the basement did. I don't really know why. Most people are more afraid of basements, but there was something about our attic that really got to me. If I had to guess, I'd say it was because our attic was slightly unconventional compared to what you're probably picturing. For starters, it was surprisingly spacious. Most attics are typically cramped and congested, which makes sense, but our attic was built in such a way that you didn't ever have to crouch when you were up there. You might think that would imply we used it more often, the same way anyone would use excess space. But no. I'm not really sure why, but my parents treated it like a glorified storage room. That was its sole purpose. Thinking about it now, they honestly avoided it as much as possible. The other thing about it was that it had so many nooks and crannies built into it. What I mean by that is the space was broken up by odd beams and small changes in elevation, almost like a makeshift maze. The beams were of uneven thickness, and there was no pattern to where they appeared. The result was that you couldn't stand in any one place up there and have a clear line of sight from one end to the other, and the uneven flooring was a nightmare. You could genuinely injure yourself up there if you weren't careful, and my dad used to joke that one day one of us would slip on one of the joists, fall through the insulation, and puncture a hole in the ceiling. So you can imagine why an attic like that would be scary to a little kid. The maze-like quality was what freaked me out the most. I really didn't like not being able to see the attic in its entirety, and every time I went up there, I felt like someone was hiding behind one of the beams. But anyway, what I'm about to tell you happened so long ago that I don't have a ton of other memories from that period in my life. For whatever reason, however, this memory is so vivid that it feels like a thorn protruding into what was otherwise a fantastic childhood. It happened during the week, which I remember because I had school that day. I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but I was in middle school. I woke up one morning and noticed my feet were dirty. The bottoms were gray and grimy, and there was this fine layer of grit between my toes that I couldn't explain. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at them, trying to figure out what had happened. I hadn't gone outside the night before. I hadn't done anything unusual. I'd just gone to bed, fallen asleep, and woken up with filthy feet. Being a little kid and all, I didn't give it too much thought beyond that. I just washed my feet in the bathtub and went about my day. Things only escalated from there, though. A few days later, I found a box in my room that didn't belong there. It was this small cardboard box filled with old photographs, the kind my parents kept stored away in the attic. I had no memory of bringing it downstairs, and when I asked my mom about it, she just assumed I'd been rummaging through the attic for some reason. I told her I hadn't, but she didn't seem concerned. She just took the box back upstairs, and that was that. Then it happened again. I woke up one morning and found an old lamp sitting on my desk. This ugly brass thing that I vaguely recognized from the attic. This time I was sure I definitely hadn't brought that down. I would have remembered carrying a lamp through my house in the middle of the night. But there it was, sitting on my desk like it belonged there. That's when things started clicking into place. The dirty feet, the box of photographs, the lamp. I wasn't just sleepwalking. I was sleepwalking to the attic. The realization didn't scare me right away, but it made me feel strange. The idea that I was unconsciously navigating that maze of beams and uneven flooring in the dark, completely unaware of what I was doing, was weird. I told my parents, and they reacted exactly how you'd expect. They said sleepwalking was completely normal, that lots of kids did it, and that I'd probably grow out of it. I wouldn't exactly say they were dismissive, but they weren't overly concerned either. To them, it was just one of those things. But to me, it was more than that. After the next incident, I started dreading bedtime. I'd lie in bed for hours after I was supposed to go to sleep, fighting it because I was terrified of what might happen once I was unconscious. I obviously couldn't fight sleep forever, though, and every morning, I would frantically check my feet to see if they were dirty. If they were clean, it had been a good night. If they were dirty, it had been a bad night. They were usually clean, but those few times they weren't really got to me. There was no denying that I was definitely going up to the attic regularly, and the worst part about the whole thing was that I had no memory of it whatsoever. For all I knew, I was spending more time up there than in my own bed. The fear I felt during that period was different from anything I had ever experienced. It was like this slow, creeping dread that never went away. It was awful, but nothing was scarier than what I'm about to say. I woke up one morning, only it wasn't morning. It was still dark out. It took me a few seconds to realize it, but I wasn't in my bed either. In fact, I wasn't even lying down. I was standing. That was the first thing I registered. I was standing upright in complete darkness, and I had no idea where I was. For a few seconds, my brain couldn't even process it. But then the recognition hit me. I was in the attic. The fear that washed over me was so intense that I almost couldn't breathe. I was in the attic in the middle of the night in pitch black darkness. I couldn't see a single thing, not the beams, not the boxes, not the hatch, nothing. Just absolute impenetrable black. And to make matters worse, I had no idea where in the attic I was. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. It was like sleep paralysis times 100. I knew the layout of the attic, but only vaguely, and only from memory. I also knew there were obstacles everywhere. The idea of trying to find my way back to the hatch in complete darkness was almost unthinkable, but I couldn't just stand there forever. So I started moving, slowly and painfully. I was so scared that I actually started crying, but silently. The tears were just flooding down my face, and I felt like if I made too much noise, something was going to get me. It was the most terrified I've ever been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone up there. I don't know what was giving me that thought, but I could feel something else there with me, something further in the dark, and as soon as I had that thought, I actually heard something. There was a soft thud from somewhere behind me. It honestly sounded like a footstep, or someone shifting their weight on the floorboards. I kept moving, but I heard the sound twice more, and both times it sounded like it was coming from a different spot. At that point, I was convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was something else up there with me. I don't know how long it took me to find the hatch, but I eventually did find it. I went straight to my parents' room and woke them up. I was full on bawling at that point. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I told them what had happened, how I'd had to find my way back in the dark. I told them about the sounds too, and that there was someone in the attic. I expected my dad to spring out of bed and rush up there with a baseball bat, but he didn't. They didn't even really take me seriously. My mom just hugged me and told me it was okay, that sleepwalking could be scary, but it wasn't dangerous. My dad offered to put a lock on the attic hatch if it would make me feel better, and I said yes, obviously. But I knew what I heard. I insisted that they at least check the attic, and my dad finally agreed. As I was watching my dad climb up there was a part of me that genuinely thought he wasn't going to make it back. But not 2 minutes later, he was already climbing back down the ladder. He told me there was nothing up there and to go back to sleep. So that's what I did, but lying in bed after that experience was the worst night of my life. After that, the sleepwalking did stop. I'm not sure what I would have done if it had continued, and speaking of that, I've never been able to fully accept the sleepwalking explanation. I know that's the most logical explanation. Sleepwalking is a real thing that happens to people, and there's nothing supernatural about it. But there's this part of me that can't let it go. The way I always ended up in the same place, the attic, never anywhere else in the house, and the way I was apparently capable of navigating the maze of beams and obstacles in complete darkness without even hurting myself. And most of all, that night I woke up standing in the dark. The sounds I heard, I still believe there was something up there with me, I really do. What it was, I have no idea. I'm obviously a lot older now, and I've brought these concerns up to my parents several times, but they always give me the same dismissive answers. It almost feels like they themselves don't want to think about it, which also doesn't make much sense to me. I doubt I'll ever get the answer I'm looking for. This happened when I was 14 or 15. My family lived in this old house that had been passed down for generations. My dad grew up there, and so did his parents before him. I don't live there anymore, but I still think about what I'm about to tell you from time to time. Like most houses, it had an attic. It was basically a graveyard for stuff nobody wanted to deal with, like old furniture, boxes of God knows what, and Christmas decorations. That last one was the only reason anyone ever went up there. Once a year right before the holidays, and then once more to put everything back. This happened around Christmas time, but Christmas has basically nothing to do with the story. That particular Christmas, my dad decided I was finally old enough to grab the decorations myself. He gave me the whole rundown, which boxes to look for, something about the lights being in a separate container near the back wall, and I nodded along like I was paying attention. I wasn't, not really. I was thinking about something else. We finished talking, and he sent me up to the attic. I climbed the ladder and pulled down the little chain to turn on the light. I remember looking around and thinking I genuinely couldn't remember the last time I'd been up there. But then I realized there was a problem. I had absolutely no idea what my dad had actually told me to grab. I couldn't remember any of his instructions, and there was no way I was going back to ask him to repeat himself. My dad had this thing about that. He'd get legitimately pissed off if you made him say something twice. So I just started opening random boxes that looked like they might contain Christmas decorations. I moved stuff around for probably 20 minutes, and I ended up making a complete mess of the place. I did eventually find the Christmas stuff, which spared me the anxiety of having to go back downstairs empty-handed, but the attic was completely disorganized at that point. I made like 4 or 5 trips up and down the ladder, hauling everything to the living room. Once I was done, I went back up for one last look to make sure I hadn't missed anything important. I knew I was going to have to reorganize everything up there, which I wasn't looking forward to. As I was looking around the attic, bracing myself for all the stuff I was going to have to move, I saw something up there that looked out of place. In one of the back corners, kind of tucked behind all the stuff I'd moved around, there was this box I hadn't seen before. It was black and didn't look like a flimsy cardboard box, but something sturdier, like a document box or one of those fireproof things. Despite the heavy-duty look, it somehow looked older than everything else up there. Being a curious kid and all, I obviously opened it. Inside were papers, dozens and dozens of them, like an alarming amount. Notebooks, loose pages, some hand-drawn maps, even a few pages of what looked like sheet music. And the one thing they all shared was that they were all completely covered in handwriting. The maps, the notebooks, even the sheet music. I started going through it, trying to figure out what I was looking at. The handwriting was difficult to decipher at first, but the more my eyes adjusted to the lettering, the more I was able to understand. None of the pages were dated, but they seemed to be stacked in chronological order, older stuff on top and newer entries near the bottom. I was so intrigued by that box and those papers that I told myself I wouldn't go back downstairs until I had read each one. The earliest entries were boring. Weather stuff, household tasks, random thoughts about the day. It kind of resembled a disorganized diary, and I was very quickly able to gather that whoever was responsible for writing it all was someone who had previously lived in that house. As I kept reading, though, things got weirder. For starters, the handwriting got slightly more chaotic and illegible, which was the first indication, but that was nothing compared to the content of what I was reading. Whoever wrote all of it had become obsessed with the attic. They kept measuring it. They repeatedly documented the dimensions of the attic over and over, comparing them to the footprint of the house below. According to their math, the attic was smaller than it should have been. There was space along one of the walls, like several feet, that couldn't be accounted for. They went into extreme detail about this one wall, like cracks, indents, marks. Every square inch of what made that wall distinctive was in there. The entries got even more frantic after that. Based on what I was reading, it was clear that whoever had written them was spending hours at a time in the attic, sometimes even sleeping up there. They started hearing sounds from behind that missing space, like scratching, breathing, that sort of thing. There were timestamps to go along with some of the entries, like 2:14 a.m., scratching for approximately 3 minutes. The more I read, the more I realized I was getting a first-hand account of someone's complete descent into madness. There was nothing coherent about any of it, and I didn't believe what they were writing for a second, but it only got worse. The final pages weren't even sentences anymore, just tally marks, rows and rows and rows of them, counting something I couldn't identify, and then the entries just stopped. Either the person had stopped writing them, or that was as far back as the record went. By the time I got through everything, I was genuinely shaking. I wanted to put everything back where I had found it, go back downstairs, and purge the memory of ever reading it from my brain, but there was something I had to do first. My eyes went straight to the wall the writer had been so fixated on, and the moment I realized there were actually some marks in it, I started feeling sick. I examined the wall, and some of the indents and cracks seemed to line up almost exactly with what that guy had been saying. It was a type of freaky I had yet to experience. I can only describe it as the feeling of being watched, but from multiple different angles. I could picture that guy clawing at the attic wall in a fit of lunacy. It felt like he was in there with me. Suddenly, I didn't want to spend another second in that attic. I grabbed the black box and went straight to my dad. He was just as shocked as I was. He had absolutely no idea what any of it meant, and he had definitely never seen it before. He told me he was 100% sure it wasn't his father's handwriting, which meant whoever wrote those entries must have been a person who lived there even before my grandpa. The thing was, his parents were both gone, and he knew absolutely nothing about the people who had lived in the house before them. My dad went up to investigate, and to my surprise, he took me with him. I felt a lot safer having him with me, so I didn't argue. I stood off to the side while my dad inspected the wall more meticulously than I did, using some of the pages as a guide. After a few minutes, he froze up like he was thinking. I thought he had given up, but he turned to me and told me he was going to rip the wall down. I was actually kind of shocked by that, but I was in no position to oppose him. So that's exactly what he did. He ripped that wall down with some tools from the garage, and what we saw was shocking. The writer had been right. There was a space back there, a lot of space. It was several feet deep, and it ran the whole length of the wall, but that wasn't even the worst part. The walls of the hidden space were covered in markings. Black lines, symbols, shapes I didn't even recognize. They covered almost every surface. I don't really know how to describe it, but those marks were something else entirely. They didn't look like writing. The implication was even worse than that though, because my dad and I soon realized that there was no alternative entrance to that hidden space. So how could someone have ever gotten in there in the first place? My dad and I just stood there, completely overwhelmed by what we were looking at. Eventually, once the initial shock wore off, we confirmed there was nothing else in the space, and there wasn't. The entire room was empty with the exception of whatever was drawn all over the walls. Things didn't end there. The more we thought about the situation, the less it made sense. At one point, my dad pointed out that whoever wrote those notebooks, whoever had been so obsessed with documenting every little detail, did not seem like the type of person who would so neatly organize everything in a little box and tuck it away in a corner. Compulsive behavior doesn't end with tidy archival work. That thought hadn't occurred to me until that moment, but I had to admit, he was right. But that could only mean that someone else had compiled the collection. My dad was 2 steps ahead of me. I watched as this unreadable look washed over his face. It looked like a mix of sadness and confusion. He was quiet for a little, then said it must have been his father, my grandfather. He must have found the writings at some point, gathered them together, and stored them in that box. There wasn't much to do after that. My dad admitted years later that his dad having withheld something like that from him, and why he would even do that in the first place, was something that would eat at him forever. And I don't blame him. As for me, I don't really know what to make of any of it. It happened so long ago that I don't think it matters anymore, but if I think about it for long enough, I can still freak myself out. I don't think anyone can rationalize it. There's no reasonable explanation. I used to think that whoever had written those entries was the same person who had scratched up that hidden space, and that they were probably just insane. But there were things in those pages that someone could only know after the wall was put up. But with the wall being up, there was no other way into that space. It truly makes no sense. My dad wouldn't let me keep the box when we ultimately moved out of that house. For all I know, it's still up there in that attic. All I know is this is a mystery I'll take with me to my grave. I've been a smoker for longer than I care to admit. 23 years now, give or take. At this point, it's less of a habit and more of a ritual. Something to keep my hands busy or to mark the end of a day. The thing is, I refuse to smoke inside. My parents were the same way when they lived here, even though my dad smoked cigars on special occasions. I inherited this house from them about 4 years ago when they finally pulled the trigger and moved down to Florida. They'd been talking about it for years, and I think they just needed to know the house would be in good hands before they could actually leave. I was divorced, living in an apartment that was way too small and depressing, so the timing worked out. My only complaint now is that the house actually feels too big, which sounds absurd until you realize it's a 3-story colonial and I live alone. The house also has this big backyard, probably close to an acre if you count the wooded part, and I've gotten into the habit of taking these late night walks out there while I smoke. It's peaceful. There aren't any neighbors close enough to bother me, and the only light out there comes from my house, so usually it's just me and the crickets and whatever's rustling around in the trees. I usually do a full loop around the property line, which takes about 10 minutes if I'm not rushing. It's become my version of meditation, I guess, or maybe just my excuse to smoke in peace. There is one thing that needs to be known about the house. The house itself is incredibly old. It has the creaky floors, drafty windows, all of that stuff. It's practically impossible to walk around in there without making noise. It also has an attic, which is accessed through this pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. It's essentially a big storage room, and I only go up there when I need to grab decorations or store some of my parents' stuff that I don't know what to do with, but I don't want to throw away. There's a tiny little window up there too, which overlooks the backyard. It's maybe a foot wide, original to the house, and it kind of looks out of place against the rest of the house. I've looked up at that window hundreds of times during my walks. It's never caught my attention before. That is, until about 3 weeks ago. I was doing my usual loop, halfway through a cigarette, when I happened to glance up at the house. I don't know why. I wasn't thinking about the attic or anything. My eyes just drifted upward, and for a split second, I could have sworn I saw something move behind that little window. I stopped walking and just stood there in the middle of the backyard, staring up at the attic. The window was dark, obviously. There's no light up there unless you bring a flashlight. but I was almost positive I'd seen movement. A shape passing in front of the glass maybe, or something shifting in the darkness behind it. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I'd probably just seen a reflection of a cloud or a bat flying past or something. I finished my cigarette, went back inside, and didn't think about it again. The next night, though, I saw it again. This time I was sure there was definitely something moving up there beyond just a reflection or a trick of the light. Something was in my attic. My first thought was that it was an animal. Squirrels get into old houses all the time, and I wouldn't have been surprised if there was a gap somewhere in the eaves. But then I started thinking about what kind of animal would be big enough to see from that distance, and I didn't like any of the answers I came up with. I went back inside and stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the hallway where the attic access is. I didn't hear any scratching or scurrying. I actually didn't hear anything for that matter, which did make sense. I really didn't want to go up there, but I had no choice. If something was in my attic, I needed to know about it. So reluctantly, I turned on my phone flashlight and pulled down the ladder. It was especially nerve-wracking because the layout of the attic meant I'd have to go up blindly. If there was something lurking just beyond the opening, I wouldn't be able to see it. I climbed up slowly, trying to convince myself I wasn't scared out of my mind. But I was, and my fears were almost immediately justified. I was not prepared for what I saw up there. It wasn't an animal that was up there. It wasn't a person either. The attic was a complete disaster. I don't mean messy, I mean destroyed. Everything was in complete disarray. There wasn't a box or bin unturned, but I wasn't thinking about any of that. All I could think about was the black paint, or at least what looked like black paint that was smeared across every wall up there, including the ceiling. It was disturbingly thick, almost chunky, but the worst part by far was how wet it looked, as if it had been smeared only moments earlier. It was still dripping in some places, so I was 100% sure it was fresh. That initial glimpse freaked me out so much that I genuinely almost fell off the ladder. I don't know why, but seeing that dripping paint terrified me to the point that I felt like I couldn't breathe. My brain immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. Some freak was in my house. I did one quick sweep of the attic with my flashlight to make sure there was no one in there, and that was it for me. I practically fell down the ladder in my rush to get back to the second floor. In a matter of seconds, my fear became anger. I was going to find this person, and I was going to defend myself. I started tearing through the house, checking every room, but I didn't find anything. And the more I looked, the more discouraged I got. The adrenaline was also starting to wear off, and I was becoming much more afraid again, which didn't help matters at all. I cleared the house and went back upstairs to my bedroom, thinking maybe I had missed something. But even after checking the whole room again, I didn't find anything. The moment I paused to take a breather, though, I heard something. 2 thumps, then what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The sounds were coming from directly above me, which could have only meant one thing. The attic. How stupid of me. Whoever was up there had probably never even left. They had probably been hiding behind one of the overturned storage boxes. I don't know where the courage came from, but something in me snapped. This was my parents' house, and whoever was up there violated it. Before I could talk myself out of it, I ran downstairs to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and you best believe I was ready to use it. I went back upstairs and pulled the ladder down again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the rungs, but I forced myself to keep climbing. And then I just started screaming like a full-on lunatic. I burst through the attic opening, yelling at the top of my lungs, waving the knife around like some kind of maniac. Part of it was anger, but honestly most of it was fear. I stomped around the attic as aggressively as I could, flipping boxes and screaming the whole time, but there was no one up there. I was sure about it this time. My attic isn't that big. It's just one big space, so there's quite literally nowhere to hide. There was something up there though, something new. Seeing it killed every ounce of bravery I had managed to scrape together. There were scratch marks everywhere. Long, deep gouges in the wooden beams and floorboards, like an animal had been clawing at them. The paint from before was still there, but the scratches were layered over everything, and after seeing that, I was done. I ran back down to the first floor bathroom, locked myself in there, and called 911. The police arrived maybe 15 minutes later. 2 officers went up to check the attic while I was waiting downstairs with the third one. When they finally came back down, all they could tell me was the attic was empty. They also told me they couldn't find any gaps anywhere up there. So whoever had vandalized my property and terrified me must have left through the house. I insisted that their explanation was impossible. I would have heard them leave. Like I said before, the house is incredibly creaky, so even the slightest step is enough to make a sound that I would have heard, even from a floor down. But there was nothing else the officers could do, and nothing else they could tell me, so they left. It's been 3 weeks since that night, and luckily there haven't been any further incidents. So I guess I have no choice but to believe that some homeless person snuck into my attic, vandalized it for whatever reason, and left without me noticing. But the problem is, I don't believe that. I really don't know what to make of all of this, but I refuse to believe that some homeless person caused all of it. It's something worse than that. I still haven't been back up there, even to clean the paint. I really don't know what to do. This is one of those stories I've been sitting on for a really long time. It happened back when I was maybe 25 or 26, way before I met my wife and way before we had kids. I was a completely different person back then. Not in a bad way, just in the sense that I had the kind of free time and risk tolerance that I genuinely can't relate to anymore. I used to do these solo backpacking trips a few times a year, usually somewhere in the Appalachians. I'd drive out to some remote trailhead, hike deep into the backcountry, way off the trail, and spend a few days completely off the grid. No cell service, no other people, nothing. I loved it. My friends thought I was insane, and honestly, I kind of was. This particular trip was in the Cherokee National Forest, and it changed how I see backpacking forever. I had been out there for 2 days, and everything had been going perfectly. The weather had been great, the trail was quiet, and I hadn't seen another person since the first morning. That changed pretty quickly, though. On the afternoon of the second day, I noticed dark storm clouds building up to the west. I wasn't too worried at first. I'd hiked through rain plenty of times, and it was never a big deal. But within about an hour, I realized it wasn't going to be a passing shower. The wind picked up hard, and the temperature dropped fast enough that I actually stopped to put on another layer. By the time the rain started, I was already looking for a spot to hunker down. The problem was that I was in a pretty exposed section of the trail. As I predicted, it wasn't a light rain. It went from windy to full-on downpour in minutes. The wind was bending smaller trees sideways, and I could hear branches cracking and falling in the canopy above me. I started getting genuinely concerned about my safety. Lightning was striking pretty close by, and I was hiking at elevation with a metal-framed pack on my back. Not ideal. I kept pushing forward, completely soaked at that point. I was scanning the woods on either side of the trail for anything that could pass as shelter. As if by some miracle, I actually saw a structure through the trees off to my left. It was small and dark and partially hidden by the forest, but it was unmistakably man-made. As I got closer, I realized it was a tiny, one-story cabin. They looked extremely old, like it could have been a hunting cabin or a homesteader's shelter from decades ago. There was a single window on the side I was approaching. I can't overstate how relieved I was. I practically sprinted over to the thing and pushed the door open. Inside, it was dim but dry. There wasn't much in there, just a chair, a small table, and what looked like a cot frame pushed against the far wall. There was a stone fireplace on the right side that was clogged with old ash and debris. The place honestly smelled really bad, but I didn't care about anything other than stripping out of my soaked clothes and laying down. There wasn't a couch or anything in there, so I literally just picked a spot on the floor and lied down. I was in survival mode at that point, not exploration mode. All I cared about was that I was out of the storm. It wasn't until I'd been inside for maybe 10 or 15 minutes that I started actually looking around. With the storm raging outside, there wasn't much else to do besides flick on a flashlight and snoop, so that's exactly what I did. There was more stuff in that cabin than I had initially realized. For starters, there was a sleeping bag rolled up in the corner near the cot frame. It didn't look ancient like the rest of the place, which confused me. There were also a couple of cans and water jugs on the table, which made me think someone had been using the place as a base camp of sorts. Maybe another backpacker or a hunter. It wasn't unusual to find stuff like that in remote cabins, but the more I looked around, the more things started bothering me. There were marks on the wall near the door. At first I thought they were just damage from age or weather, but when I got closer to inspect them, I could see they were scratches. There were dozens of them, some shallow and some deeper. There was no pattern or order to the marks, at least not one I could see. I stepped back and looked at the door itself. The handle was a simple latch, which wasn't unusual. Despite the storm, I opened the door just to get a look at the mechanism. There was a metal bracket on the outside of the frame, which looked like it was designed to hold a padlock. The bracket was on the outside. There was no corresponding latch on the inside. That meant the door could only be locked from the outside. Things only got stranger. I shut the door and started looking around the cabin. The only thing I hadn't checked out yet was the window, so I walked over to it. The glass was still perfectly intact, which surprised me given the apparent age of the place. But then I noticed why. There were screws drilled into the window frame, one in each corner securing it shut. Those had also been driven in from outside, and around the edges of the frame on the inside, there were more scratches, deep ones. These were unmistakable. They honestly looked like someone had tried to pry the window open with their bare hands. All of it hit me at once. Someone had been kept in this cabin, trapped, as in kept against their will. I should have left right then, and I did consider that, but there was a good part of me that felt like whatever had gone on in that cabin was well in the past. Everything in the cabin looked really old. Even the sleeping bag, which did look on the newer side, admittedly, was rigid and dusty. Plus, the last thing I wanted to do was go back out in that storm again, so I stayed. I'm not sure how much time passed, maybe an hour, maybe more. The storm wasn't letting up at all. If anything, it had gotten worse. The rain on the roof was so loud that it was hard to hear much of anything else. That's probably why it took me so long to notice the other sound. I picked up on the scratching or scraping noises from outside, somewhere along the left wall of the cabin. At first, I thought it was a branch, but I couldn't remember if there had been branches low enough to even touch the exterior of the cabin. As I was thinking about it, I heard two heavy thumps on the porch. They honestly didn't sound like storm sounds. This time I stood up. I did that thing where you freeze in place and try to focus by staring at a random spot on the wall. I was trying to listen, but if someone was moving out there, it would have been impossible to hear over the storm. I started getting paranoid that those sounds I heard were just a few of many, and that the rest had been drowned out by the rain. My eyes drifted over to the window. I couldn't bring myself to look through it. If someone really was out there, they'd probably be looking through it. I stayed in that position for what felt like forever. After a while, I started to relax a bit, thinking I had just been hearing the storm, or at the very worst, an animal poking around the cabin. I was almost ready to forget about everything when I heard something that sent me over the edge. Pressure on the door, like someone was leaning their full weight against it from the other side. The wood creaked and the latch rattled once before the pressure released. My heart rate instantly shot back up, and that's when something clicked. Why would someone be outside in a storm like this, circling the cabin, tapping on the walls, without just coming in? The door wasn't locked. Nothing was stopping them. And then I thought about what I'd found inside the cabin, and it occurred to me that maybe whoever was out there didn't want to come inside. Maybe they wanted me to stay inside. Maybe the whole point was to keep me in there. I don't know if that was the right conclusion or if my mind was just spiraling, but I decided I was leaving right then. I didn't care about the storm. I started moving things into my backpack as fast as I could. I had this sickening feeling that something really bad was about to happen, and I was right. The next few moments were a blur. I was maybe 30 seconds from walking out the door when I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me. I spun around just in time to see something come through the window, and that was all I could see before the whole room erupted in flames. The flames spread so fast that I couldn't even process what was happening. 1 second I was standing in a dark room, and the next second the walls were on fire. The heat hit me like a physical wall, and the door wouldn't budge. It was jammed from the outside. I slammed into it with all my might, and it gave. It collapsed off its hinges, and me with it. I scrambled to get back on my feet, and I just ran. I couldn't even see. I was just running wildly through the woods and rain, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cabin. But before I could get a safe distance away, I felt something tackle me from behind, and I was back on the ground. There was a person on top of me, and suddenly I was fighting for my life. I clawed and kicked and screamed, but this guy wouldn't get off me. He was yelling too, and he kept trying to get me in a chokehold. He was gouging at my eyes and pulling my hair, and I started to feel dizzy, but I managed to push him off. I got back up and kept running, and whoever had just tried to kill me was screaming like a maniac. I looked back twice. I couldn't see my attacker, but I did see the cabin, which was fully engulfed in flames. I think the picture of that fireball is burned into my brain forever. The second time I looked back, the glow was smaller but still visible through the woods, but I just kept running. For all I knew, I was being chased. I didn't stop until my legs gave out. I found a spot where a couple of large trees had fallen against each other, and there was a narrow gap underneath that blocked most of the rain. I crawled under there and just collapsed. I couldn't feel my body. I don't know if it was the fire, the rain, or the attack. Maybe all three, but I was completely numb. All I did was sit in that crouched position and try to keep breathing. I don't know how many hours passed under those trees, but time lost all meaning. Eventually, I felt some feelings start to re-enter my body, and I told myself it was move or die. Whoever was out there was probably looking for me, and he couldn't have been that far away. So I got up and started moving through the woods. I didn't know where the trail was, but I didn't really care. I honestly can't tell you how I survived that night, but I did. I stumbled onto a random trail and just followed it. I was soaked and probably bleeding from multiple places, but I just kept trudging on. Eventually, the rain subsided a bit, at least enough for me to figure out where I was. I made it to some random trailhead, and by that point, the storm had passed. I don't remember too much after that. All I remember is that the first person I saw drove me to a hospital. I had second-degree burns on my left forearm and the back of my neck, and doctors told me I was lucky I hadn't inhaled more smoke than I did. None of it was permanent, but it hurt like hell for a long time afterwards. By the time I was healed and safe at home, I told myself I would never camp or hike alone again. Someone had intentionally set that cabin on fire to kill me. That's the only thing that makes any sense. It was pouring rain, a full-blown thunderstorm, and the roof was metal. There's no way a wooden structure goes up like that fast unless the wood had been treated with something beforehand. I gave the police everything, or as much as I could, but I could tell they weren't really going to do anything. And to be fair, I wasn't in a charted part of the woods, so it would have been silly to hound them. The only thing I don't understand is the timing of everything. My wife would probably tell you I stopped doing solo trips because I grew up and got more responsible, and she's not entirely wrong, but I honestly never told her about this incident, and I know I'll never go backcountry trekking again alone. My name is James. This happened maybe 7 or 8 years ago, back when I was in my early 20s and still doing stuff that I probably shouldn't have been doing. I had this friend Charles, who was kind of notorious in our friend group for finding cool places to explore, like abandoned buildings and old factories. If it was somewhere you weren't supposed to be, Charles had probably already been there and can tell you exactly how to get in. He spent a weird amount of time on Google Earth and these niche urbex forums, and he'd always be hitting the group chat with screenshots of random places he wanted to check out. Most of us would entertain his ideas, but never actually follow through. I was usually the exception. Charles and I had been friends since high school, and I think the reason we got along so well was that we had similar thresholds for risk. While most of our friends would hear his pitches and go, "That sounds insane," I'd hear them and go, "When are we going?" It was a dynamic that led to some great memories and a few situations that I look back on now and genuinely wonder how we made it out unscathed. This story is about one of those situations. One weekend, Charles texted me about a fire lookout tower he'd found deep in some forest not far away from us. I really wish I could remember the name of the forest, but I can't. Charles said it had been decommissioned years ago and was just sitting out there in the middle of nowhere, completely untouched. He didn't tell me how he'd found it, but I didn't want to know. He was convinced we could hike out to it, climb it, and spend the night up there. I was more skeptical. I mean, things like that are usually fenced off or at least protected somehow, but I promised him I'd at least come and check it out. To be fair, the idea of being 70 feet or so up in the middle of a forest with a 360-degree view sounded incredible to me. We picked a random weekend and made it happen. Charles planned the entire thing out, including the drive, what to pack, and how to find the tower once we were in the woods. It was a 3-hour drive away, and Charles told me the hike would be off the trail, but pretty short, about 4 miles or so. We drove out early in the morning on Friday and made it into the woods sometime in the afternoon. For some reason, I was kind of expecting us to get lost, or at the very least not find the tower, which is exactly why I was all the more astonished when we actually did. Seeing it through the trees for the first time was an insane sight. I remember blurting out "no fucking way" when I saw how tall it was. I was even more astonished when we got to the base of it and realized it was completely unprotected or fenced off. It was just sitting there in the middle of the woods waiting for us to find it. The cab at the top was this small, square room with windows on all 4 sides. There was a metal staircase that zigzagged up the frame, with a section of vertical ladder for the final stretch up to the cab. The whole thing looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Some of the lower railings were bent or missing, and there was graffiti on the support beams near the base. To be completely honest, it did not look like the type of structure anyone would be eager to climb, but Charles was practically giddy. While I was hesitating and debating whether I should try convincing him to back out, he had already started climbing. I yelled at him to be careful, and that got him to slow down. I figured what the hell, and told myself to stop bitching. The 2 of us made our way up carefully, checking the stairs as we went. Most of them felt solid enough, but there were a few spots where the bolts had rusted through and the steps wobbled. The vertical ladder section near the top was the sketchiest part. It was 20-something feet of straight climbing with nothing but a narrow metal cage around it. The adrenaline rush was insane, but that's what Charles lived for. He made it up without any issues. The view from the cab was unreal. You could see for miles in every direction. We had also timed it perfectly. The sun was maybe an hour from setting. Our plan was to camp out for the night and catch the sunrise. There was a decently wide wraparound walkway up there, which is where we decided to chill, at least initially. We cracked a few beers and just enjoyed the view and some conversation. The sun eventually went down, and the sky went from orange to purple to dark blue in a matter of minutes. Once the light was gone, the forest below us was just a black mass in every direction. There wasn't a single light in sight. The stars were incredible, easily the best I've ever seen. But being alone out there in the dark was freaking me out a little. It was just weird not being able to see anything, despite knowing there was a whole forest below us. Charles could tell I was getting a little antsy, and he started messing with me, grabbing my shoulder and stuff like that. But the thing that pissed me off the most was when he smacked his metal water bottle against the side of the tower. It sent this incredibly loud, echoing clang in every direction, probably to be heard for miles. The sound was so loud and ominous that I actually got mad at him. I told him I wanted to go inside the cab, and he finally got the hint. There wasn't much in there, by the way. It had clearly been hollowed out ages ago. He said he was going to finish his beer before coming in and joining me, and I was fine with that. I picked a random corner and started setting my sleeping stuff up. But before I could finish, he told me in a very quiet, serious voice to come back outside. Very un-Charles-like. So I did. I walked back around to where he was sitting and saw that he was pointing diagonally downwards, toward the forest below us. At first I thought he was just messing with me again, but it only took me a few seconds to realize what he was pointing at. There was a light down there. It was faint and pretty far away, but it was definitely down there, and it was genuinely horrifying. It was weaving through the forest at what seemed like walking pace, and my first thought was that it was a person who'd heard the clang from the tower. I don't know why I felt the urge to whisper, but I did. I told him he was stupid for doing that, and we were probably moments away from getting caught or arrested or something. He looked at me with this confused expression before saying, "You think that's a person?" Now it was my turn to be confused. What the hell was he talking about? I asked him what else it could be, and he said that light was moving way too evenly. He wasn't exactly wrong. The light wasn't swinging or wobbling the way you'd expect someone carrying a lantern or flashlight to be. But then again, it was probably too far away to tell. I didn't say anything after that. Neither did Charles. He just kept staring at this mysterious light as it continued weaving through the forest. Part of me thought it was just some random hiker that had nothing to do with us, but I knew that was wishful thinking. After a few minutes, it was obvious that the light was getting closer. It was also much clearer that the light was moving perfectly, like it was floating or hovering. Charles asked me what we should do, and I didn't have an answer for him. There wasn't really anything we could do. Like, what were we gonna do, climb down? As we were throwing out more theories, the light suddenly zipped forward, like it skipped a beat. It was really thick, but for a split second that light went from steady, even movement to an abrupt zip forward. Then it was back to steady movement again. I started feeling my palms start to sweat, and I could tell Charles was really freaked out too. I kept trying to convince myself that whoever was down there was just wandering aimlessly through the woods, but again, wishful thinking. They were definitely heading for the tower, and after about 10 minutes, they reached it. At that point, the light was directly below us, and I was bracing myself for someone to yell up to us and announce themselves as police. But no, the light just stopped moving and stayed in that exact spot right below us. From our vantage point straight above, we could see the light itself, but not whoever was holding it. Charles and I stared at it for a while. The suspense was killing me, but it must have been killing Charles even more, because he again did something I wanted to throw him off the tower for. This guy actually yelled, "Hey, are you good?" down at the light, revealing our presence. I looked at him in horror. I genuinely couldn't believe he would do something so stupid. We didn't get a response though, and the light didn't even move. We waited a little bit, and then Charles yelled down again, but still nothing. So there we were, 70 feet up in an abandoned fire tower in the middle of nowhere, with someone or something blocking our only exit. We were completely trapped. We must have watched that light for 30 minutes straight, whispering to each other every so often. It never moved once. I wasn't worried about being secretive anymore. Charles had burned that bridge a long time ago, so I did something I should have done a while ago. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it straight down at the base of the tower. But even after I did that, I still couldn't see the source of the light. Eventually, we accepted that there was nothing we could do and tried to go back to what we were doing. We went back to talking, but I made sure I never took my eyes off that light for more than a few seconds. Charles thought it was some kind of LED that someone had placed there to mess with us, but who the hell would bother doing that? At some point, Charles said he was going to climb down and check it out, and I told him that was insane. Not only was that inviting trouble, but it was downright stupid and dangerous. As we were arguing about it, I glanced down and realized that I couldn't see the light anymore. There was just darkness and more darkness down there again. I frantically scanned the emptiness below us with my eyes, looking for the light, but it wasn't there anymore. Charles seemed relieved, but I was the opposite. He kept telling me to relax, saying whoever had been there had probably left, but I was more freaked out than I had been when the light was just sitting there motionlessly. The thought that someone could be down there, and now we couldn't even see them, was terrifying to me. Charles reassured me that we'd obviously be able to hear if anyone tried to climb the ladder, which I guessed was true, but I was still really unsettled. Suddenly, I didn't want to be in the open air anymore. I suggested that we wait out the rest of the night from inside the cab, and he agreed. So we went inside and set up our sleeping bags. Neither of us were going to sleep though, that was suicide. Staying awake turned out to be the right decision, because not 20 minutes after going inside, we started hearing noises. The first ones were all metallic clangs that echoed up through the steel frame of the tower. They weren't footsteps, which I want to be crystal clear about, because I was listening specifically for footsteps, and this was not that. It sounded more like someone struck one of the support beams with a wrench or a crowbar. A few minutes later, another one came. This one was more of a grinding sound, like metal being twisted against metal, and it lasted for a good few seconds before stopping. Charles and I kept looking at each other like we were expecting the other one to do something, but there was nothing we could do. The sounds kept coming from what sounded like different spots, which was what really got me because it meant whatever was causing them was moving down there. The sounds continued on and off for a while. I kept trying to map out the sounds in my head, figure out where they were coming from, how many sources there were, whether they were getting closer or staying at the same level. I couldn't make sense of any of it. Charles and I were whispering to each other about what we'd do if we started hearing someone walking up. I was sitting against the far wall of the cab, facing the windows on the opposite side. Charles was on the opposite side, looking over my shoulder. There were so many windows in there that we didn't feel safe and wanted to be able to see out of all of them. There wasn't much to see though. They were all pretty dark, with the only light being from the stars and the moon. But then, I saw something. A dark outline moved across the glass. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing fast enough, but then it passed in front of the next pane over, and that's what did it. I couldn't help but yell, and Charles scrambled away from the window. The two of us immediately ran over to the door and pressed our backs against it. If someone tried to come through that door, they were going to have to push through both of us. I kept looking for the figure through the windows, but I couldn't see anything. That was impossible though. Unless they were crawling on all fours, I should have been able to see them. Charles and I sat up like that for a really long time, and I could hear him hyperventilating. What followed was the most tense and terrifying few hours of my life. Charles and I sat there in that exact position like our lives depended on it. By the time the sun started coming up, I was completely exhausted. When it was finally light enough to see, I counted to 3 and then swung the door open violently, expecting someone to be crouching behind it, but there was no one there. Charles and I ran around the side of it to confirm that, and it was clear. I looked down to the base of the tower, and there was nothing down there either. We grabbed our stuff and started descending as fast as we could. We made it about 3/4 of the way down the staircase before Charles stopped in front of me. He just stood on the landing, staring down at the next section of stairs. I looked past him and saw it immediately. An entire section of the staircase was gone. It wasn't just a few steps. I'm talking about an entire section of stairs, straight up missing. It was impossible, but we were staring at it. Someone had deconstructed an entire section of staircase during the night while we were sitting directly above them. That must have been what those sounds were. But that didn't make sense. The noises didn't stop until after I had seen the person up there. So had they really crossed that gap twice? In the dark? No way. Plus, there's absolutely no chance someone could have done that without us hearing it. That would have been a lot louder than a few clangs here and there. We stood on that landing for a while, trying to figure out what to do. We had to just jump across. It wasn't that far, but it was still scary. Charles ended up twisting his ankle, but I was fine. We made it the rest of the way down, and that was that. There was no one waiting for us at the bottom. There was actually nothing there at all, including the metal steps that had been removed, at least as far as we could tell. Granted, we didn't look around too much. It didn't make any sense, but we weren't sticking around. I still don't have an explanation for any of it. Not the light, not the sounds, not the figure I saw outside the window, and definitely not how someone managed to remove an entire section of steel staircase in the middle of the night without us hearing it. Every time I see Charles, this is something we still talk about. I go camping alone a few times a year. I've been doing it since I was in my 20s, and at this point I'm in my late 30s, so close to 15 years of solo trips at this point. I know the risks, which is why I carry a rifle. This happened about 2 years ago in the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky. It's a massive stretch of forest, over 700,000 acres, and if you know where to go, you can hike for days without seeing another person. I had a rough stretch of work and my head wasn't in a great place, and I felt like I just needed a few days away from everything. I drove out on a Thursday morning. I parked at a trailhead off a Forest Service road and started hiking. The plan was simple: 3 nights in the backcountry. That was pretty much it. I had my tent, my pack, enough food and water for 4 days, and my .308 bolt action that I always bring on solo trips. The first day was exactly what I needed. I covered about 7 miles before finding a flat spot near a creek bed that looked like a good place to camp. I set up my tent, gathered some wood, and had a fire going by the time the sun started going down. I cooked some food, drank a beer, and sat by the fire until it burned down to embers. The whole time, I didn't see a single person. I fell asleep around 10. I woke up at some point in the middle of the night. I'm not sure what woke me. It was more like my brain just switched on for no reason, the way it does sometimes when you're sleeping somewhere unfamiliar. I lay there for a minute and stared at the ceiling of my tent, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something. There was a faint orangey glow coming through the walls of my tent. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Maybe 200 yards away, through the trees, there was a fire. Not a big one, it was about the size of a campfire, but it was definitely there. It was flickering, which is how I knew it was a fire. I watched it for a few minutes, waiting to hear talking or something. I wanted to confirm it wasn't some random forest fire, but after a while of looking at it, I couldn't see or hear anything beyond the fire. I watched it a little while longer just to see if it would grow out of control, but it didn't. I figured it was another camper set up nearby that I just hadn't noticed during the day. It wasn't impossible, especially since I had gone to sleep relatively early. I figured whoever it was had gone to sleep and left their fire going, which is irresponsible but not uncommon. I watched it for about 5 more minutes, and then zipped my tent back up and went to sleep. It didn't bother me too much. When I woke up the next morning, the fire was the first thing I thought about. Not because it had scared me, but because I was curious. I wanted to see who else was out there, maybe say hi, but mostly to satisfy my curiosity. I packed up my campsite and hiked in the direction where the fire had been. It took me about 10 minutes to reach the area. I was pretty confident I had the right spot. There was a natural clearing that lined up with the angle I'd been looking from. But when I got there, I stopped. There was no fire pit, nor was there a ring of stones or a pile of ash or scorched ground, charred wood, nothing. The ground was completely undisturbed. I walked the whole clearing, checking for any sign that someone had been there, but there was no signs of life whatsoever. The area was pristine. I stood there for a while, genuinely confused. I was certain I'd seen a fire. It had been a campfire burning clearly for at least 5 minutes while I watched it, and yet the ground where it should have been looked like no one had set foot there in months. I considered the possibility that I had the wrong spot, but there wasn't another clearing anywhere near the right distance or direction. There wasn't much I could do beyond that though, so I just moved on. I still had 2 more nights planned, and I wasn't about to cut my trip short over something silly like that. I hiked for most of the day. The terrain changed as I moved deeper into the forest. The creek bed fell away behind me and the ground started climbing. By mid-afternoon, I was in a denser, older section of the forest where the trees were taller and the canopy was thick enough to block out most of the sky. It was quieter in there, which was nice. I found a good campsite around 4. That evening was uneventful. I doused my fire a little after 9 and turned in for the night. I don't know what time it was when the sound woke me up, but it was loud enough to pull me out of a dead sleep. I woke up to this distant, enormous cracking sound, like a thick branch being snapped in half, except it kept going. It was violent, and it lasted for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. At the tail end of it, there was a deep, resonant thud that I could quite literally feel in the ground beneath me. I instantly knew what it was. A tree had fallen somewhere deeper in the woods, or at the very least, a very large branch. If you've ever heard the sound of a tree falling before, which I do understand is kind of a rare occurrence, it's amazing and terrifying at the same time. It didn't scare me per se, but the deafening force and scale of it gave me this crazy adrenaline rush. I lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to figure out what had just caused it. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. It wasn't storming, and there was barely any wind. There was nothing I could think of that would have brought a tree down on a night like this, but there was also nothing I could do. I couldn't fall asleep at that point either. My heart was still racing, and the adrenaline had me awake, so I just kind of closed my eyes and waited for it to wear off. But then, not 10 minutes later, it happened again. Only this time, it was much louder. That same gruesome crackling sound, followed by a crash of branches and a deafening thud, but this one was close. Not right on top of me, but close enough that the sound was almost disorienting, and it came from a completely different direction than the first one. The first tree had fallen somewhere to the south, and the second one was to my northwest. I sat up immediately. Now I was actually scared. 2 trees falling on the same night in 2 different parts of the forest with no wind and no storm. That was inconceivable. I kept trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. The most logical thought was that the first one had caused some kind of chain reaction, but that hypothesis didn't account for the fact that the trees fell in completely different parts of the forest. Whatever brought down the first tree had nothing to do with the second one. They were 2 different events. But that was even more inconceivable. I was sitting there processing all of this when I heard something new. Something that took my fear from a medium 5 to a resounding 10. It was this low and continuous rumbling sound that I can only describe as a cross between a groan and a growl, like a person clearing their throat, except it didn't stop. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. I've heard bears, I've heard elk, I've heard bobcats. This wasn't any of those. It sounded like something was making the noise on purpose, and it went on for what felt like a full minute without any break or variation. I did the only thing I could think to do. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around as quietly as I could, and aimed it at the tent flap. At that point, I was full on panicking. I must have sat like that for 20 minutes. The sound eventually tapered off. It didn't stop abruptly, it kind of faded out, like whatever was making it had moved further away. And just like that, the forest was quiet again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I don't think I would have been able to if I tried. It was the worst night of my life. As soon as I saw daylight, I got out of the tent. I packed up as quickly as possible, still spooked and extremely unsettled despite being able to see. Once everything was in my pack, I started walking in the direction of the second tree, the louder and closer one. I needed to see it, if only to confirm that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I had my rifle ready in my hands, so I found the tree after about 10 minutes. The thing was massive, and its trunk was lying at an angle across a shallow slope. Broken branches and debris were scattered all around it, so it was real. I really couldn't believe it. I'd been trying to convince myself I had just imagined everything from the night before, but there it was. I needed to keep investigating. I wouldn't have been satisfied leaving without knowing what had caused the fall. I walked over the stump, which was about 3 feet high. The wood where it had broken was pale and fresh, but the break wasn't clean. It wasn't the kind of jagged, splintered fracture you get from wind stress or root failure. The wood around the break point had been torn apart in a way that I had never seen before. Parts of the stump looked like they'd been gouged. I really don't know how else to describe it. There were long, irregular grooves running through the wood at different angles, and it looked like some of them were up to an inch deep, at least. The wood genuinely looked like it had been stripped and chewed rather than cut or snapped. The more I looked, the more I noticed. Some of the bark around the base had been peeled away in long strips, and the exposed wood underneath had that same gouged, chewed-up look. I can't pretend I knew what I was looking at, because I didn't. I'd seen beaver damage before, and this was not that. Beavers leave clean cuts. I'd seen woodpecker damage, and this wasn't that either. This was aggressive, messy, and covered way too much surface area to be any animal I could think of. The tree hadn't fallen because it was dead or because the wind knocked it over. Something had worked on that trunk until it came down, and suddenly I felt this really nasty feeling in my gut. I needed to leave. I stopped examining the tree and started backing away, but as I was turning to leave, something near one of the tree branches caught my eye. There was a small cluster of items sitting on the ground. If it weren't for the fact that they looked man-made, I wouldn't have even bothered checking them out. As soon as I saw what they were, I lost my shit. It was a blue bandana and a carabiner, and they were both my items. I instantly started digging through my pack and confirmed those 2 items were missing. In that moment, I grabbed my stuff, shoved it in my backpack, and ran. I didn't know if running was the right decision, if that would have attracted attention to me, but I did anyway. I just needed to get out of those woods. I got tired after a while under the weight of all my stuff, but I moved as fast as I could. The hike back took me most of the day, and the entire time I felt like I was being stalked or watched. I felt like something was going to jump out from somewhere any second. I kept my rifle in my hands the entire time. I made it back to my car around 3 in the afternoon. I drove out of there so fast, despite my exhaustion. The first thing I did when I got to a safe distance away was call the police. I don't think they took me very seriously, but I didn't care. I also knew there probably wasn't much they could do, but I didn't care about that either. I was pretty messed up for days afterward. None of it made any sense whatsoever. What I couldn't get over was the fact that my stuff had been rummaged through. Something had either stalked me through the woods, or knew where I was the entire time. That unexplainable fire from the first night must have had something to do with it. There's no way that was a coincidence. And those trees, I still have no explanation for what could have cut them down. I genuinely don't think it was anything human, but as for what animal it could have been, I have no idea. I still go camping, believe it or not, but this is something that I think will hang over me forever. I've been a canine handler for almost 9 years. My partner is a 4-year-old German Shepherd named Rex. He's trained in tracking and narcotics detection, and he's solid. He doesn't spook easily. I've taken him into warehouses, abandoned houses, woods at night, and he's always steady. That's why what happened that night stuck with me. We were called in to assist patrol on a house search after a foot pursuit in the area. Officers had attempted to stop a male suspect a few blocks away, and he ran. They chased him through backyards and lost sight of him near this property. A side gate to the yard was found open and the back door of the house was unlocked. Neighbors had also reported hearing a struggle in the backyard, which added to the urgency. Patrol swept the first floor, but weren't comfortable calling it safe. They believe the suspect may have forced his way inside and could still be hiding somewhere in the house. Rex and I arrived about 20 minutes later. The house was a 2-story place in a quiet subdivision. There were no signs of forced entry from the front. The officers on the scene briefed me quickly. Long story short, they told me there were no obvious signs of struggle, just the open access at the rear of the house and the fact that the suspect had vanished within yards of it. I put Rex on a short leash and gave him the search command. He pulled forward immediately, moving from room to room on the first floor. The living room was clear, kitchen was clear, and laundry room was clear, so we moved upstairs. Up there was a narrow hallway with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. There was no fresh air up there and no draft. All the windows seemed to be closed. As to be expected, as the neighbor reported that the owners of this house were not in town. Rex and I went into the first bedroom, then the second bedroom. Then he pulled toward the bathroom at the end of the hall. I examined the little bathroom, and overall it seemed clean. Nothing was out of place in any of the rooms. Rex sniffed around the room, the edge of the vanity, the floor, then he froze. His ears went forward, and his body stiffened up. He started growling, looking outside the bathroom door. His growls then turned to barks. He was staring out into the hallway, growling and barking at something out there. I stepped backwards out of the bathroom with him. "What is it?" I said quietly. Rex was locked onto something down the hallway. At the very end, near the last bedroom door, I saw what he was barking at. This figure standing there. This tall, dark, completely still figure, and it didn't look like any of the officers downstairs. They also would have in some way announced their presence to me. I identified myself as police, and that there was a canine with me, but there was no response to this. Then I just flat out asked, "Who is that?" Still no response. Rex was pulling in the opposite direction, something I'd never seen him do before. He didn't want to go down the hall. Then the figure turned and walked into the bedroom at the end of the hall. I knew every officer on scene. I knew where they were positioned. None of them were upstairs with me. Rex planted his feet when I tried to move forward. He pulled backwards hard. He did not want to go down that hallway. I drew my weapon and said over the radio that I have possibly located the suspect at the end bedroom. Start making your way up. I pulled Rex forward, and he resisted the entire way. He kept looking at me like he didn't understand why I was making him go. When we reached the bedroom doorway, he refused to cross with me. I stepped into the room first with my gun raised, but it was empty. Like completely empty. Just a bed against the wall and a dresser across from it. I waited for the others to get up there before fully entering the room. And when we finally entered, there was no one standing in there or hiding under the bed. The window was closed and even the closet was empty. There was no kind of attic hatch or crawl space door. Rex stayed in the hallway. He wouldn't step foot into the room. I expected the others to doubt me, but they saw Rex and the way he was acting. One of them tried coaxing him into the room. He refused. We searched every inch of that bedroom. We checked the walls for false panels, we checked the bathroom again, we checked the other bedroom. There was not a single trapdoor anywhere. If it weren't for Rex, I feel like I'd have gone crazy. After about 20 minutes, I told the others I had to take Rex out of there. But before we left, he kept glancing back down the hall at that bedroom. As soon as we stepped outside into the night air, he relaxed slightly. When he was in his crate, he curled up immediately, but he didn't look at me the way he usually does after a search. Patrol wrapped up not long after. I've replayed that moment 1,000 times in my head. I think I believe it was a real person, the suspect even, but I don't know how they escaped that room, or why Rex behaved that way. Maybe more suspicious people than me will say what Rex and I saw was a ghost. Rex has never reacted like that before, or since. He's tracked armed suspects without hesitation and entered a lot more stressful environments than that house. But that room, he wouldn't step inside. I trust that dog more than I trust my own instincts. Just about everyone in my department has at least one unexplainable night call, and this one was mine. When I turned 21, I joined the police force in a remote town that I won't name. The department needed new officers, and I was a young father who needed money, so the timing was perfect. Because I was a rookie, they assigned me to the night shift. It ran from 6 at night to 6 in the morning. The guys at the station sometimes teased me about my hours, saying that I always worked the crummiest shifts. I actually didn't mind them. I've always been a night owl. Besides busting people for speeding and pulling over the occasional drunk driver, I spend most nights sitting back listening to podcasts. In a weird way, it was kind of relaxing. After a year in the department, something happened one night that changed everything. A severe thunderstorm rolled into town and caused major power outages. Torrential downpour flooded most of the major roads. To be in the best position possible when accident reports came in, I parked my cruiser in a parking lot in the middle of town. At 2 a.m., our dispatcher Claire radioed in. She reported that someone who sounded like an adult male claimed to have been kidnapped. They told her they were held captive inside someone's home. Then the call ended. When she redialed, the caller didn't answer. My cruiser had a built-in computer display that showed all the call details. Based on the address, I was about 10 minutes away, so I was probably the closest officer. I radioed in and told her I'd respond. I also requested backup. Another new officer named Chris chimed in and said he'd be on location in 5. Claire clicked on her radio but hesitated for a few seconds over the static. Then she said the caller sounded like they were altering their voice in some way, possibly through digital means to make themselves sound like a child. She used the specific phrase, "like a young girl." She concluded that officers should proceed with extreme caution. All of us were pretty close at the station, so we felt nervous for one another during high-risk cases like this. I radioed back and said 10-4, then drove off to the scene. When I turned into the neighborhood, I saw that every single street lamp was out. The entire block had lost power. That meant we would have low visibility into the home we were investigating, which put us in greater danger. I followed my GPS to the end of the street where the house was, and I saw that Chris had already beaten me. His cruiser was idling in front of the house. I pulled up next to him and rolled down my window. Chris commented on the home's poor condition. I glanced ahead, taking it in for myself. The grass was knee-high, overgrown bushes blocked out the windows. The roof was dented in several areas, and had a ton of missing shingles. It looked completely abandoned. This sent off alarm bells in my head. You can gather a lot about someone's mental state by how they treat their living space. I told Chris I'd take the lead. We both stepped out of our cruisers into the pouring rain, opened our umbrellas, and followed a waterlogged path up to the door. Chris clicked on his flashlight. Whenever a second officer like Chris is present during an investigation, their entire job is to protect the leading officer by monitoring the suspect's body language. If the suspect makes a move on the cop that's interrogating them, they neutralize the threat. Chris made the perfect backup, because he was both observant and calm under pressure. This allowed me to focus solely on the suspect's story, and if I was hearing the truth. When we reached the door, I rang the bell. Then we stood there, listening for movement inside. After a few seconds, footsteps shuffled up to the door, then they paused. Whoever was on the other side was completely still, just waiting. A feeling came over me that we were being watched. Slowly, my gaze drifted over to the peephole. As soon as I made eye contact, a distorted shape moved back, like whoever was watching us had pulled their head away. "If you're in there, we'd like to ask you a few questions. Open up, please," I said. They froze again, as if they were thinking about what to do next. Then the lock started turning and the door creaked open, but only by a foot. From the darkness, a man peeked out of the crack. He looked like he was in his early 30s. He was overweight, balding, and wore thick-brimmed glasses. I took a single look into his eyes and sensed that he was hiding something. I informed him that we'd received a call from his address of someone claiming to have been kidnapped. The man acted confused. He apologized and told us it must have been a pocket dial. I asked him if it was a pocket dial, then how could he explain the voice in the phone call? For a split second, the man averted his gaze, then said he didn't know anything about a voice. I asked him if there was anyone else in the house, and he said he lived alone. Then I told him that for safety reasons, we needed to have a look inside. Not without a warrant, he said. These days, a warrant can be obtained in minutes. I went back to my cruiser, called dispatch, and requested communication with the on-call magistrate. 5 minutes later, Claire came back on the radio and told me the judge approved a telephonic warrant and emailed it. We were clear to enter. I showed the warrant to the man. He reluctantly pulled the door open, and I could see that his hands were visibly shaking. I clicked on my own flashlight and stepped inside. A putrid smell immediately hit me. I scanned around to find the source and saw a hallway straight ahead and a room directly to my right. I shined my light into the room and saw what looked like a living room. It was absolutely disgusting. Piles of clothes and stacks of dirty dishes were spread across the carpet. Cockroaches were even crawling all over them. A couch that looked like it was pulled off the side of the road sat at an angle against the wall. This man obviously used this room as his living space. I'd seen these sorts of living conditions in drug cases before. When I turned to look back at the man, he shifted uncomfortably. I made a mental note to check for paraphernalia once I'd confirmed the house was safe. Then I stepped toward the hallway. My foot struck something. I looked down. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw a pink Barbie doll playhouse that I knew I'd seen before. I thought about it and realized I'd bought this exact set for my daughter last year on Christmas. I asked the man if he had kids. He said no, but explained to us that sometimes his nieces came over, so he kept a few toys around for them. Chris and I exchanged a look. No mother in their right mind would allow children into this environment. I told him this was his last chance to tell me if anyone else was in the house. He assured me there wasn't. I started my way down the hallway, and the man followed, saying that nothing was down there. Chris yanked him back by his arm and ordered him to stay put. The hallway had an open room on either side and a closed door at the end, which was probably the basement. I peeked inside the first room, scanning from right to left, and saw more children's toys and even items like diapers scattered across the floor. In the corner, the dark shape of a person was hunched over. I drew my weapon, only to realize that it was a doll sagging its head down in a rocking chair. The shock of that visual made my heart pound. I leaned against the doorframe and steadied my breathing. Chris asked me what I had seen. Before I could respond, I started studying the doll. It was the largest one I'd ever seen, every bit as big as a person, and the man had dressed it in women's clothing. On the bed beside it, ladies' blouses, jeans, and lingerie were folded into neat piles. Each pile was separated by color. Meanwhile, the rest of the house was a pigsty. What was happening in this room felt wrong on many different levels. All clear, I told Chris. I moved further down the hall and glanced into the second bedroom. This one was empty. I reached the final door at the end of the hall when from behind me, the man called and asked if I'd like to see the upstairs instead. I told him yes, but first I was going to see the basement. The man said again that there was nothing down there, and I heard Chris tell the man to stay still, which meant he was probably trying to follow me down the hall. The closer I moved into this part of the house, the more agitated he became. I reached for the handle, twisted the knob, and pushed the door open. It squealed on its own hinges. A set of wooden steps descended into a pitch-black room. I shined my light down. I could only see the area that surrounded the landing. It looked equally as messy as the upstairs. From deep inside the room, in an area I couldn't see, something rattled. I told Chris that I heard movement. The man responded instead, apologizing to me and Chris over and over. Even though it was the last thing I wanted to do, I had no choice. The man was lying to us. Someone was down there. I headed down the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight. The rattling noise from inside the room grew louder. Behind me, the man repeatedly begged us to stop looking around. I neared the landing and swept my flashlight across stacks of boxes. No one appeared in my line of sight. Across the room, there was another door. The noise was coming from there. I drew my weapon. I commanded whoever was inside to come out slowly with their hands up. Whoever was inside stopped moving. I shouted the same command a second time. The door remained shut. I crossed the room, sliding between boxes and old furniture that blocked the way. My sights were trained on the door. When I stood within several feet, I paused, listening. Whoever was inside also remained perfectly still. My anxiety ticked up with each second. So many things could go wrong in this situation. I moved to the side of the doorframe in case they were armed and tried to fire through the door. I reached for the knob, grabbed on, and twisted. Then I swung the door open. I was still hidden to the side of the frame. If anything besides empty hands emerged, I would have to use deadly force. After several agonizing moments, nothing came. I said a quick prayer, then aimed my weapon right into the room. What I saw, I can't go into detail on, but basically, This is what happened. A man in his mid-40s was being held captive in that basement. He was a father of 3 and a respected member of the community. Months after he went missing, everyone, including his family, assumed he was dead. After 2 years in captivity, he finally got the chance to escape. Earlier in the night, before we arrived, the homeowner brought the victim's dinner down and made the mistake of leaving his phone behind. The victim managed to activate Siri and call 911. When we arrived on scene, the victim had already been confined in a way that prevented him from calling upstairs or making any kind of substantial noise. Then, when I ordered him to come out, he froze in fear, not because he couldn't obey my command, but because he didn't want me to use lethal force, thinking that he was a threat. Once I opened the door and found him, we arrested the homeowner on the spot and took the victim to the hospital for immediate treatment. I feel incredibly lucky that no one was harmed, and that we could reunite this man with his family. But the most disturbing detail, which has haunted me every day since, is how my dispatcher described the voice of the man who made the call. Why was he speaking like a child? The only explanation that makes sense is that this man was forced to speak in that young tone of voice for so long that even when he called the station, that's the only way he could communicate. And if he was forced to do that, what else inside that house was he forced to do? I've been a patrol officer for a little over 8 years now. I've worked nights for most of that time. You see a lot on midnights. For example, I've lost count at how many domestic fights, drunk drivers, break-ins, and overdoses I've had to deal with. After a while, most calls start to blend together. You show up, then separate people, you take a report, possibly make an arrest, and then move on. There are only a handful of calls that ever stuck with me. This is one of them. It happened in late October a few years back, around 2:40 in the morning. Dispatch toned me out for a 911 hang-up. The caller had reported hearing a woman screaming from inside the house next door. The address was on a quiet residential street, one that most people are familiar with, lined with single-family homes in a decent neighborhood. Nothing that generated a lot of police activity. The caller said the screaming had stopped by the time she dialed 911, but she was sure that she heard someone yelling for help. I was only about 5 minutes away. When I pulled up, the street was dead silent. Most of the houses had their lights off at this time, of course. A light rain had started to fall, just enough to make the pavement shine under the streetlights. The house in question was a 2-story place with a small front porch. There were no lights on inside that I could see from the street. I parked a few houses down and approached on foot. As I got closer, I noticed the front door was slightly cracked open. That immediately raised my guard because it confirmed some validity to what this woman had reported. I radioed dispatch and advised I was on scene and had an open door. I asked for another unit to start my way, but at that time of night, the nearest backup was about 10 minutes out at least. I stepped onto the porch and listened. The only sound was the light rain hitting the ground. I knocked on the door frame and announced myself, "Police Department." No response. I knocked again a bit louder. At that point, with a report of screams and an open door, I had exigent circumstances. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. Nothing really stood out, such as any kind of signs of forced entry or weird smells. The living room was directly ahead of me, and everything looked normal and neat. There were no signs of a struggle. I searched the living room first, checking behind the couch and in the corners. Then I moved toward the kitchen. My flashlight beam bounced off clean countertops and a sink full of dishes. There was a glass on the table with what looked like water still in it. I remember that detail because I made a mental note of it, meaning that someone had been sitting there not long ago. I called out again, "Police Department. If anyone is here, make yourself known." My voice sounded too loud in the quiet home. Rarely would I get nervous on a late-night call, but something about this was creeping me out. I kept expecting someone to answer from upstairs, but no one ever did. I moved down the hallway toward the back of the house. I remember the layout. There was a small bathroom on the right, a guest bedroom on the left, both clear. At the end of the hallway was a staircase leading up. As I stepped onto the first stair, I heard a sound from above, like a quick faint shuffle, like a foot dragging across carpet. I stopped and listened. I drew my weapon and continued up the stairs slowly, one step at a time, keeping my light aimed ahead. The upstairs hallway had 3 doors. 2 were closed, one slightly open. The open one was at the end. As I reached the top, I heard it again. A soft movement from that direction. I announced myself a third time and told whoever was inside to show their hands. No response. I approached the open doorway and pushed it wider with my foot. It was a bedroom that was larger than the one downstairs. The bed was unmade with the sheets partially hanging off the side. A lamp on the nightstand was knocked over onto the floor. That was the first thing that looked wrong. I stepped inside and checked the closet. It was empty. Then I checked under the bed. Nothing. The window was closed and locked. No obvious way in or out from that room. I felt that uncomfortable feeling in my chest you get when something isn't adding up. The rest of the upstairs still needed to be cleared. The second bedroom was a kid's room from the look of it because of the toys on the floor, the small dresser, and posters on the wall. There was no one inside. The last door was the bathroom. As I reached for the handle, I noticed something on the carpet outside the door. A dark spot. At first, I thought it was just a shadow from my flashlight, then I realized it was wet. I crouched down and touched it with my glove, and it was blood. Not a huge amount, but enough to form a small pool. My heart rate went up instantly. I called it out over the radio and asked dispatch to expedite backup. People may forget police officers are people too, but when we're in these kinds of situations, we're just as scared as anyone else. I pushed the bathroom door open and flicked on the light with my elbow. The shower curtain was closed. There were streaks of blood on the tile floor leading toward the tub. I moved closer and yanked the curtain back. The tub was empty, but there was more blood near the drain. The blood looked as though someone had been standing there bleeding. I checked everywhere in the bathroom to no avail. By this time, backup was still a few minutes out. I was alone in a house with fresh blood and no victim. I did another sweep of the upstairs, but slower this time. That's when I heard a faint sound from below, like a floorboard creaking under weight. It came from the first floor. I moved back toward the stairs and aimed my light down into the darkness. The living room was still dark and I couldn't see movement, but I felt it. That feeling like you're being watched. I descended slowly, trying to control my breathing. When I reached the bottom, I cleared the living room again, the kitchen too. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. A door near the refrigerator that I'd assumed was a pantry. It was slightly ajar now. I was almost certain it had been closed earlier. I approached it and opened it wider. It wasn't a pantry. It was a narrow set of stairs leading down into a basement. The light switch was at the top. I flicked it up, but it did nothing. Either the bulb was out or the power was cut down there. The stairs descended into complete darkness. I radioed again, advising I was going into the basement. No way was I waiting up there with someone possibly moving around below me. I started down the stairs. The basement was unfinished, and as I went down, I noticed concrete floors, exposed beams, and boxes stacked along one wall. As I stepped off the last stair, I saw a chair in the middle of the room, a metal folding chair, and the floor beneath it, a large pool of blood, bigger than what I'd seen upstairs. The chair had zip ties attached to the armrests. They were cut. I scanned the rest of the basement. That's when my light hit movement in the far corner. A figure bolted behind a stack of boxes. I yelled for them to stop and started moving toward them, but they moved fast, heading toward the back of the basement where there was a small window near the ceiling. I heard glass shatter. By the time I reached that corner, the windows had broken and whoever it was had forced themselves through. The window led to a narrow side yard between houses. I climbed out after them, cutting my hand on the glass in the process. Outside, it was still raining. I could see a dark shape sprinting toward the alley at the end of the block. I chased for a bit, but lost them once they turned the corner. Backup arrived minutes later. We set up a perimeter. K9 responded, detectives came out, but we never found the person who ran. The house turned out to belong to a man who lived alone. He wasn't there. We found his wallet upstairs and his phone on the kitchen counter. There were signs he'd been restrained in that basement chair. The blood matched him, a lot of it, but not enough to confirm he died there. He was never found. The neighbor who called 911 swore she heard a woman screaming. We never identified any female connected to that address, and no signs anyone else lived there. I don't know if I interrupted something in progress or if I walked in after it was already over. If they hadn't made that one mistake in the basement, knocking over that stack of boxes, I might have walked out of there thinking it was a false alarm. The missing man's case is still technically open. Every once in a while, I drive down that street on patrol. A new family lives in that house now. I see the kids' bikes in the driveway sometimes. Like I said, it's a normal neighborhood. But sometimes fucked up things happen in the most normal neighborhoods. This happened last year. I was 22 at the time, completely burnt out from work, and I was going through one of those stretches where everything in life felt like it was happening to someone else. I won't get into specifics, but let's just say I had a colorful past, and by that point, I was actively trying to put some distance between myself and certain chapters of my life. What I needed more than anything was to disappear for a few days. We've all been there. I must have been venting out loud because one day at work, I found myself having a conversation with a coworker about this tiny island off the coast of Maine. The way he described it, the place sounded almost aggressively boring. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark, and most people just took the ferry out for the day and left before sunset. He said if you stayed overnight, it was like having the whole island to yourself, which was exactly what I was looking for. I found a vacation rental listing for a standalone cottage right on the shoreline. The price was suspiciously cheap, and it was available on short notice, which probably should have raised some flags, but I wasn't exactly in a cautious headspace. I booked it without thinking twice. The cottage itself was small, just a single room with a bed, an unused kitchenette, and a bathroom the size of a closet. It was set back from the water, surrounded on 3 sides by thick brush that pressed right up against the walls. The front faced the ocean, with a single window covered by this thin, semi-translucent curtain that didn't do much to block the view in either direction. The walls were paper thin. I could hear the wind moving through the brush like it was right next to my ear. The door had a deadbolt and a chain lock that both looked like they'd been installed recently, which struck me as a little odd for such an isolated spot, but I didn't dwell on it. I took the late afternoon ferry over and spent the early evening just walking around the island. It was kind of surreal watching the place empty out as the day visitors filtered back to the mainland. By the time the sun went down, there was almost no one left. No streetlights, no ambient noise, nothing. I was pretty much left alone to enjoy the sounds of the ocean by myself. It was beautiful. I grabbed dinner at this little pub near the ferry landing. The bartender was friendly enough, but I noticed that she gave me a weird face when I told her where I was staying. On the walk back, I passed a small dock tucked into a cave maybe 100 yards from the cottage. There was a single blue motorboat moored over there. It stood out because all the other boats I'd seen on the island were larger lobster vessels. I made a mental note of it, but didn't think too much beyond that. I got back to the cottage around 10:30, locked the deadbolt and the chain, and settled in for the night. Up until that point, I was really enjoying the time away from everything. But of course, that peace didn't last. I realized my phone charger was busted, or maybe it was the outlet I was using. But the point is, my phone wouldn't charge no matter what I tried. I tried every outlet in the cottage. My phone was on low battery, and I was 100% sure it was going to die within the hour. Luckily, I didn't really need it to get back to the ferry. I had a physical ticket, but no one likes having a dead phone. I decided to just call it a night and go to sleep. I was exhausted anyway, and I did fall asleep pretty quickly actually. The exhaustion from the past few nights hit me all at once, and I was out within a few minutes of my head hitting the pillow. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I don't know what pulled me out of my sleep exactly, but once I was awake, I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside the cottage. They were close, right in front of the door, and whoever was out there was taking their time, which I could tell because there was a long pause in between each step. It definitely didn't sound like an animal scurrying around. I shifted in bed just slightly, and the footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't really describe. It stretched on long enough that I started to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, or that it really had just been an animal. I didn't want to move, so I just stared at the ceiling in that same position. I'm not sure what I was waiting for, but I was so freaked out that I couldn't even think straight. And a few minutes later, the footsteps came back. This time there was no mistaking the direction. They weren't passing by, they were approaching. I heard them come right up to the entrance of the cottage and stopped directly in front of the door. At that point, my heart was damn near pounding out of my chest. I felt like they could hear it, but there was nothing I could do besides try and be as silent as possible. As if the situation wasn't bad enough, whoever was out there turned on a flashlight and tried shining it through the front door. I couldn't move because I was petrified in fear. That person clicked off the light and tried the door handle. I shut my eyes and prayed the deadbolt would hold, and it did. I thought that would be enough of a deterrent, but I was wrong. A few seconds passed, and then they tried again, putting more weight into it this time. Then came several hard bangs, one after another. The sound was so loud in that tiny little cottage that I actually flinched with each impact. The bangs activated my brain though. The threat was more real, and even though I was still terrified, I knew I had to do something. So without thinking, I jumped out of bed while that person was still banging on the door and crouched down behind it. I was fully prepared for what was about to happen, but instead of that person bursting through the door, everything went quiet. I stayed crouched down for a few seconds, trying not to breathe too loudly. And then, and I still remember this vividly, whoever was on the other side of the door spoke. "I know you're in there, Leo." I almost yelled out in shock, but I stopped myself. It was a man's voice, one I didn't recognize, but he somehow knew my name. He knew I was there. The footsteps moved away from the door and along the side of the cottage. I tracked the sound as it passed the bathroom wall and continued around. He was taunting me. He knew I was in there. My confidence was gone. Hearing my own name was enough to make me dizzy. It was the scariest moment of my entire life. Over the next stretch of time, I have no idea how long, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, whoever was outside circled the cottage. I had no idea what they were doing, and a part of me was screaming for them to just break down the door and get it over with already. Eventually, the footsteps receded from the cottage. Then, from the direction of the dock, I heard an engine start. It was the unmistakable sound of a small outboard motor. I listened as it pulled away from the shore and faded into the distance across open water. I didn't sleep after that. That's not an exaggeration. I stayed awake the entire night. The second it was bright enough to see, I was out the door. The gravel around the cottage told the whole story. There were heavy boot prints circling the cottage multiple times. The prints led in a straight line from the cottage toward the dock and ended right at the waterline. The next day was honestly a blur. I returned the key to the property owner, boarded a ferry, and made it home. But I was not in a good headspace. Here's the thing that still gets me. Whoever was outside that cottage didn't come from the island. They came by boat, specifically to that cottage, and on that specific night. They knew my name and exactly where I'd be. The thing is, I have absolutely no idea how they could have tracked me down. I confronted my coworker about it a few days later, the one who told me about that island in the first place, and he swore up and down he hadn't told anyone about my trip. And honestly, I believed him. He looked genuinely freaked out when I told him what happened. I mentioned earlier that I have a colorful past. I'm not going to get into the details, but let's just say, I'm not exactly shocked that someone out there might want to find me. What I still can't wrap my head around is, how did someone track me to some random island off the coast of Maine? How did they know which rental I'd booked, and on which night? How long had they been watching me before any of this? I don't have any answers to any of those questions, and the worst part is, I still work the same job and live in the same place. Nothing has changed since then, but I have no reason to believe things are over. This happened many, many years ago. I'm a structural engineer, and at the time I was finishing up my graduate thesis on concrete degradation in marine environments. It was very boring, but it's what got me invited to Japan. This is all relevant, by the way. I was in Nagasaki for an academic conference. There was this professor I'd been corresponding with who had done extensive research on post-industrial decay. His name was Dr. Yamamoto, and he pulled some strings and arranged something I never thought I'd get access to, a research permit for Hashima Island. If you don't know Hashima, you've probably seen pictures of it without realizing. It's this tiny island off the coast of Nagasaki that looks like a battleship, completely covered in crumbling concrete apartment blocks. It used to be a coal mining operation, one of the most densely populated places on Earth at its peak. They abandoned it in the 70s when the coal ran out, and it's been rotting ever since. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Tourists can technically visit, but only on guided tours that stick to a narrow concrete path along the seawall. Civilians are expressly forbidden from entering the actual buildings due to structural integrity concerns. But I wasn't subject to the same restrictions, of course, which was thrilling and a little scary. I had to sign an exhaustive stack of papers, basically waiving my right to damages should I injure myself or something. The morning of the visit, I took an early ferry from Nagasaki. It wasn't a tourist boat, but rather a smaller vessel arranged through the research office. It was just me and my escort, a guy named Takeshi. He didn't talk much. I didn't really mind because I was so hyped about the excursion. The approach to Hashima plays tricks on your eyes. When it first appears within your line of sight, it looks deceptively small, insignificant almost. But then, as you get closer, the scale of it hits you. The seawall wrapping around the entire island, the apartment blocks stacked on top of each other. It really is something else. I had seen hundreds of photos, but none of them prepared me for actually laying my eyes on what I can only describe as a true wonder. Takeshi gave me the briefing on the dock. I had access to several buildings beyond the normal tour route. He actually had a list, but there were still rules, such as stay on designated paths, don't enter anything marked with red tape, don't remove anything, don't touch anything you don't need to, and stay within visual range of him at all times. He said that last part twice. I also had to wear a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and these bulky reinforced work pants that made it a little difficult to walk. Despite all the excess gear, the first couple hours were amazing. I was taking photos, taking notes, completely in my element. Takeshi followed at a distance, occasionally glancing at his watch. He clearly wanted this over with. We entered one of the large residential blocks around midday. The stairs were intact, but barely. You could see daylight through the gaps in the landing. Takeshi waited on the ground floor while I went up, which I thought was a little strange given his whole stay within visual range speech, but I wasn't going to argue. It was kind of irritating having him follow me around anyway. I was on the 4th floor examining a section of wall where the concrete had completely separated from the rebar underneath when I noticed something off. The dust patterns were wrong. There was dust everywhere, obviously decades of it, but there was this path through it, like someone had been walking this route regularly. Not recently maybe, but often enough that the dust hadn't fully settled back. I followed it with my eye and realized it led to a room at the end of the corridor. I should have gone back down to tell Takeshi, which would have been the smart thing, but I was curious and wanted to check things out for myself. He probably would have just ushered me back downstairs anyway, depriving me of ever getting an answer, so I carefully walked over to the room and pushed the door open. I immediately noticed two things, both of which were incredibly unsettling. Firstly, there was this weird smell emanating from the room that I didn't recognize. It didn't really smell like anything natural, but I couldn't recognize it as any kind of human smell either. I know that makes no sense, but that specific smell was genuinely something I have never encountered before. The second thing was even more confusing. The wall I touched was hot, or at least noticeably warmer than any of the other surfaces I'd felt on the island. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process it. You might be thinking the warmth was probably due to sun exposure, and yeah, that makes perfect sense. That's what I was thinking too, even though there weren't any gaps in the ceiling. And I figured the smell could have been animals, even though I wasn't aware that any animals even lived on Hashima. I went back down and mentioned it to Takeshi. His reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't ask me any clarifying questions or even seem that concerned. He just told me that what I saw was impossible, and that no humans or animals lived on the island. He didn't even ask me to take him to that room. When I insisted that he follow me so I could show him the smell for himself, he flatly refused. His reaction was really disturbing, to be quite honest. We continued the tour, and I started being much more observant every time he allowed me to enter a building. I kept noticing weird things, nothing fully revealing like clothes or anything like that, but weird markings and signs that something had been there. I say something because I didn't know whether I was seeing signs of a person or signs of an animal, which was the most confusing part. At one point, I mentioned more of these sightings to Takeshi, and this time he didn't even respond. Instead, he just pulled out his radio and spoke rapid Japanese into it. I had no idea what he was saying or who he was even talking to, but it was the first time he had used the radio since we got off the boat. When I asked him what he said, he told me he was checking the schedule. I obviously didn't believe him, but what was I supposed to do? Demand that he tell me what he said? I just ignored him, but I was significantly more unsettled after that. It was almost like he knew what was going on and just didn't want to tell me. We reached a taller residential block near the center of the island. Takeshi hesitated at the entrance. He actually stopped walking and stood there for a few seconds before following me in. I remember thinking that was weird. He'd been bored and impatient all morning, and now he was all attentive? But I didn't care. I wasn't going to let someone else's attitude stop me from exploring. The stairwell was narrow and dark, but structurally sound. We went up maybe 5 floors. Takeshi was right behind me the whole time, which felt like a change from his earlier indifference. And then, after walking into one of the corner rooms up there, I saw something that immediately validated all my previous concerns. Against one of the walls was a pile of blankets and a few empty bottles of water. There was no mistake about it this time. I was looking at definitive evidence of human habitation. I regained my composure after the initial shock and turned to show Takeshi. There was no way I was going to allow him to dismiss my claims this time, but when I stepped out of the room, he was gone. I don't know why, but seeing those items in that room didn't terrify me until I realized I was alone up there. It was like Takeshi having disappeared unlocked my brain, and only then was I able to process how scary the situation truly was. There was someone else on that island. I suddenly felt a very acute urge to strip out of my gear and scratch myself. My whole body was itching, and I was starting to freak out. I frantically made my way back to the stairwell we'd come up, thinking I'd just run down and end the trip short. But no, as if things weren't bad enough, I turned the corner and realized the stairs were blocked. There was a pile of rubble spilled across the landing, enough that I couldn't get through. I didn't have time to think about whether it had collapsed naturally or whether someone had piled it there purposefully. I just turned and ran. I ran past that room and down the corridor, praying that there was another stairwell somewhere close by. I didn't care about the structural damage anymore. I was so scared and didn't care about anything other than getting the hell out of there. As I was sprinting down the hall, I heard movement from somewhere behind me. It sounded like footsteps stepping out into the hallway. I didn't turn around, no chance in hell. I just kept running. The only problem was that it was like a maze in there. I was too scared to think straight, and I felt like I was running in circles. The whole time I could hear footsteps behind me. At first I thought it was Takeshi, but after a while I realized there were multiple sets of footsteps, which meant I was being followed by multiple people. I finally found another stairwell, and I practically jumped down it. I don't remember much about getting out of the building. I remember daylight and then sprinting across open ground and then the dock. Takeshi was just standing there by the boat. Seeing how unfazed he looked took me from scared to downright angry. I started screaming at him about what I had seen, about the people in that building, about him abandoning me, everything. I think I even accused him of piling that rubble up in an attempt to strand me in there. He barely even blinked. It was like he wasn't hearing what I was saying. I wanted to put my hands on him, but that would have been a terrible idea. He was my way off the island. He had all the power. I had none. The way he didn't even react to what I was saying only made me angrier. At one point, I actually kind of hoped that whoever had been stalking me in that building would turn a corner so Takeshi would believe me. He waited for me to finally calm down, and then instead of acknowledging anything I had said, he just said we were leaving. I didn't know what to think. I was still pretty unsettled and scared at what had just happened, but I was also horrified that this guy was refusing to acknowledge any of it. It genuinely made me think that he knew something about what had happened. Or worse, maybe he had caused it himself. Maybe he had been the one to pile that rubble. But the worst part was that I had to sit through an entire ferry ride back to the mainland with him. I was genuinely worried for my safety, but we made it back, and that was that. As soon as I got somewhere safe, the first thing I wanted to do was report my sightings. That there were people on Hashima. That was extremely concerning. So I contacted the only person I could think to contact. The only person who had any connection to both me and the island. Dr. Yamamoto. But I couldn't get a hold of him. Fast forward 2 weeks. I was back in the US at that point, and I still couldn't get a hold of him. It was like he had disappeared. I tried my best to report what I had seen to the relevant authorities. But I don't think anything came of it. I don't think anyone believed me. It's been years and years and years since this all happened, but this is a story I'll tell anyone who will listen. Strangely, the thing that gets to me the most isn't what happened on the island, but what happened after. The fact that I couldn't get in contact with Dr. Yamamoto, despite him going to great lengths to arrange my visit to the island. The thing I regret the most is not taking more action to get to the bottom of what was going on there. If I had spoken Japanese, or if I didn't have to return to the US so quickly, I might have been able to do something. This is something I'm gonna think about forever. This happened a long time ago. I'm talking 10 plus years. It was during my very last semester of college. I was majoring in history, and I was deep into my senior thesis, which focused on abandoned institutional spaces, places like defunct hospitals, asylums, rehab centers, especially ones that still existed in or around major cities. One of the cases I was writing about was North Brother Island. It was this overgrown island right in the East River, technically part of New York City, but it had been completely abandoned for decades. As far as I know, it's still exactly the same, but I haven't been in New York City in forever, so I really wouldn't know. Here's a very abbreviated history. It used to house a quarantine hospital, then a rehab center, and then at some point in the distant past it became off limits to the public. Unless something's changed, you still need a permit to even set foot there. In fact, it's probably even more heavily guarded considering how seriously the US takes security and whatnot these days. That's all you really need to know about it, but for any fellow history buffs out there, feel free to do your own research. You might even find my thesis. I never actually planned on going, that would have been illegal, but I mentioned it offhand one night to two of my friends, Jansen and Jesse, while we were drinking. I was probably pissed at how long it was taking, knowing how lazy and unproductive I was back then. Surprisingly, they both thought my thesis sounded really interesting, despite the fact that neither of them were history majors. So I told them some of the interesting tidbits about the various places I was researching. The moment they realized one of the places was quite literally tucked away in the very city we were sitting in, they were hooked. Jansen and Jesse, and I guess myself by extension, were really into that whole urban exploring, edgy vibe back then. Back then, it was decently popular among young guys at the time. They both thought it sounded like the perfect target for an urban exploration trip, and I'll admit, after all the research I'd done, I was curious too. Not in a ghost hunter way or anything, but more like, if I was going to describe the place in my thesis, why not actually see it with my own eyes? Fast forward a few weeks, and that's how we found ourselves sneaking through Barretto Point Park in the Bronx at 2 a.m. with 3 solo kayaks in tow. It was one of the few spots along the shoreline where you could launch without attracting too much attention, and it was only about a half-mile paddle to the island. We had a bunch of supplies, probably more than we needed, but we figured we'd play it safe. The plan was to leave around 2:30, explore the island for a few hours while it was still dark, and be back before sunrise. It felt stupid and thrilling at the same time, the best kind of fun. Getting our kayaks into the water was surprisingly seamless. I guess I hadn't anticipated how deserted the park was going to be at that time of night. But as soon as we started paddling toward the island, the reality of what we were doing began setting in. There wasn't anything stopping us anymore. All we had to do was paddle at that point, and a bit of nervousness started creeping into what had just moments earlier been pure excitement. Regardless, we made it to the island. Pulling the kayaks onto shore was a bit of a struggle because of all the overgrowth. We had to push through some tall reeds and weeds just to find a somewhat stable spot to leave them. Once we were on solid ground, the three of us just kind of stood there for a second, taking it all in. It was dark, obviously, but we had flashlights, and the moon was bright enough that you could make out the general shapes of things. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it all was. I know that sounds cliche, but you have to understand, we were technically still in New York City. The Bronx was right there, maybe half a mile away, and yet it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. We started walking inland. It didn't take long for Jansen and Jesse to realize just how big the island actually was. I had told them beforehand that it wasn't some tiny little rock. I think I even showed them a map at some point, but they clearly hadn't internalized it. As we made our way deeper, we started passing building after building. Most of them partially collapsed or so overgrown that you could barely tell they were buildings at all. At one point, Jesse stopped and just stared at this one structure that had a tree literally splitting it in half. He said it looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic video game, like one of the ones where you're scavenging through the ruins of civilization. He wasn't wrong, that's exactly what it felt like. There was something almost alien about the way nature had reclaimed everything, like the island was actively trying to swallow any evidence that humans had ever been there. I remember thinking that if I didn't know better, I'd assume the place had been empty for centuries, not decades. We explored a few of the more intact buildings, shining our flashlights into rooms that hadn't seen visitors in God knows how long. Most of them were empty, but in one of the larger buildings, Jansen found something on the ground near a doorway, a half-empty can of spray paint. He immediately wanted to use it, and Jesse was on board. I told them no, that it felt disrespectful, not just to the buildings, but to the history of the place. People had lived there and people had died there, but they pointed out that there was already graffiti all over the walls, some of it pretty elaborate, and argued that a little more wasn't going to make a difference. I didn't have the energy to keep fighting about it, so I told them I wasn't going to stop them, but I wasn't going to stick around and watch either. In hindsight, wandering off was probably a mistake. I made my way through a few more rooms, trying to take mental notes for my thesis, but the further I got from Jansen and Jesse, the more unsettling everything became. It's hard to explain unless you've been in a situation like that. When you're with other people, even in a creepy place, there's a buffer. You can tell yourself it's fine because nothing bad would happen with witnesses around or whatever. But being alone is a completely different story. I was walking down a long hallway in one of the larger buildings. I think it might have been part of the old hospital complex, when I heard Jesse's voice call my name from somewhere ahead of me, from one of the rooms further down the hall. The sound of it made me jump, and even though I knew it was him, I was still pretty freaked out. I started walking toward it, and something began to feel off. For Jesse to be ahead of me, he would have had to take a completely different route through the building. That wasn't impossible. There were multiple hallways and stairways, but it would have meant he left Jansen almost immediately after I did, and then speed walked or even ran just to loop around and end up in front of me. That didn't make any sense. Why would he do that? There were too many rooms branching off from the hallway, and I couldn't tell exactly which one the voice had come from, so I called out to him, asking where he was. I got a response almost immediately from a room just a few doors down on my left. It was definitely Jansen's voice, and all he said was, "In here." I walked toward it. The doorway was dark, darker than the hallway, which was already pretty dark, and I couldn't see anything inside. I figured Jesse and Jansen were probably just messing with me, trying to scare me for wandering off, which is exactly the kind of thing Jansen would think was hilarious. I stepped into the room without really thinking about it, and swept my flashlight around the room. It landed on a figure standing in the far corner of the room, facing the wall. For a split second, my brain tried to convince me it was one of my friends, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. Whoever this was, they were really tall, easily 6.5 feet, maybe more. Neither Jansen nor Jesse were anywhere close to that height. I can't express how scary seeing that figure was. I screamed. I couldn't help myself. I ran out of that room as fast as I could. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I was yelling for Jansen and Jesse to run as loudly as I could. I've never been more scared in my life. I felt like whoever had been in that room was going to catch me, or something else would jump out from one of the many pitch-black rooms I was running past. I found my friends near where we'd originally split up. When they saw me sprinting toward them, they just started running too. We didn't stop until we reached the kayaks. Once we caught our breath, I told them everything. They didn't believe me at first, which I completely understood. If Jansen had told me the same story, I would have assumed he was messing with me. But I pleaded with them to believe me, that I wasn't making it up, and after a minute or so, they actually started to look more scared than me. We decided to just leave. Whatever we'd come to see, it wasn't worth sticking around after that. But right as we started dragging the kayaks back toward the water, all three of us heard it at the same time. It was faint but distinct. A moaning sound coming from somewhere in the darkness behind us. It sounded like a woman, an older woman, either crying or wincing in pain. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough that we could hear it clearly if we focused. None of us said anything, but I could tell Jesse and Jansen were losing it. I was too. My hands were shaking. We finally got the kayaks into the water. The paddle back felt like it took forever, but we made it. The whole drive, none of us could stop talking about what happened. We went over every detail, trying to make sense of it, trying to come up with some rational explanation. But the thing I kept coming back to, the thing that freaked me out the most, was the voice. Because that was definitely Jesse's voice I heard in that hallway. I know Jesse's voice as well as I know my own, and whatever called out to me sounded exactly like him. Except Jesse was nowhere near that part of the building. He was with Jansen the whole time. I've thought about going back to the island over the years, but I never have. For one thing, I'm pretty sure it's basically impossible now. From what I've read, they've really cracked down on unauthorized access. Even if I wanted to, I don't think I could get within 100 yards of that place without getting intercepted by someone. I really don't believe in the paranormal, I never have, but I have a hard time explaining what happened that night any other way. Someone was on that island with us, someone who knew my name, someone who could make their voice sound exactly like Jesse's. I don't think I'll ever get an answer to what happened that night. It was 2022. I was living in the Bay Area at the time, Oakland specifically, and I'd driven up to visit my parents in Eureka for the weekend. If you've never driven Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, it's beautiful during the day and kind of a nightmare at night. Like long stretches with no other cars, no cell service, barely any lights, kind of ominous really. I left my parents' place around 8 p.m. on a Sunday, which was stupid in hindsight. I should have just stayed the night and driven back Monday morning. But I had an early shift and figured I'd rather just knock out the drive. Famous last words, I guess. The first couple hours were fine. The stretch I was on had narrowed down to a 2-lane road at that point. That's how most of rural 101 is once you get north of the bay. It was somewhere around Trinidad when the fog started rolling in. Fog on that part of the coast isn't unusual, but this was different. Within maybe 5 minutes, it went from clear visibility to barely being able to see 20 feet ahead of my car. It was actually really bad, worse than I'm describing. I slowed down to maybe 35 and kept going. The smart thing would have been to pull off and wait it out, but there's really not a lot of places to stop on that stretch. And honestly, I just wanted to get home. I figured if I took it slow, I'd be fine. Here's the thing about fog that thick though, and any California driver knows this, but it messes with your sense of space. You can't see landmarks, you can't tell how far you've gone, you can't see what's coming up ahead. It's disorienting as hell, especially when you're already tired. After another half hour or so of driving, I saw a figure standing off the side of the road. I say figure because that's genuinely what it looked like at first. Just a shape on the shoulder, maybe 50 feet ahead. As I got closer, I could see it was a person, a guy based on how tall it was, and he was just standing there facing the road. He wasn't walking or waving me down like he needed a lift, and it didn't look like he was on the phone either. He was genuinely just standing there. I slowed down even more as I passed because I was worried about clipping him if he stepped out into the road. He didn't move though. He didn't even turn his head to watch my car go by, which was really creepy. I got a good look at him as I passed, and there was nothing about his face that struck me as particularly unusual. My first thought was maybe his car broke down somewhere and he was waiting for a ride, which would make sense, right? Except I hadn't passed any cars on the shoulder, and there was no reason for him to be standing in that exact spot facing that exact direction. There was nothing there. I thought about turning around to ask if he needed help, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. It wasn't my problem, so I just kept driving. About 10 minutes later, though, I saw him again. I'm not exaggerating, it was the same guy. Same build, same dark clothes, same stance on the shoulder. The only difference was that this time he was on the left side instead of the right, but everything else was identical. I actually said "what the hell" audibly out loud to myself, because there was no way this guy could have gotten ahead of me. I was the only car on the road, and there weren't any cross streets or shortcuts or anything like that. The only explanation was that it was a different person who just happened to look exactly like the first guy and was standing in exactly the same weird way. I didn't want to look at him as I passed, but I couldn't help myself. I had to confirm whether it was the same guy, and after getting a good look, I was dead certain it was. But this time, the guy actually locked eyes with me as I passed, and I couldn't look away fast enough. Seeing his head snap to my eyes was really freaky, and I instantly regretted making eye contact. I sped up a little, not a lot, because the fog was still thick and I wasn't trying to drive off the road, but I sped up enough that I was pushing 45. I wanted distance between me and whatever the hell was going on back there. The fog got even worse after that though. I could barely see the center line at that point, so I really had no choice but to slow back down. I was having trouble thinking straight, which I attributed to the mixed effect of how tired I was, how hard it was to drive, and what I had just seen. I kept trying to rationalize it, but I couldn't. My train of thought was interrupted though, because not 3 minutes later, my headlights exposed something ahead. There was another person up there, only this time he was standing in the middle of the road. I had no choice but to stop, which is exactly what I did. This time he was wearing a hood that was covering his face, so I couldn't see what exactly he looked like, but I had a feeling it was the same guy. He once again didn't move, which is when I started really getting scared. We were at a standstill, and even though I couldn't see his face, I could feel him looking at me. I didn't know what to do. I flashed my brights at him a few times, trying to get him to move out of the way or at the very least react, but he didn't. I put the car in reverse, and when I looked in my rearview mirror, I nearly died. There was someone behind me. There was a person back there, creeping towards my car. I yelled, "Holy shit," and put the car back in drive. I was boxed in, but I didn't care. There was an actual threat on my life now. I pulled hard to the right, crossing into the opposite lane to get around the guy blocking the road ahead. The guy didn't move, and I thought I was in the clear. But then something hit my car from behind. It wasn't just a light tap. It was violent. The whole back end of my car jolted to the right, and I heard this awful crunching sound, like metal on metal. I maintained control of the car and kept driving, thinking I had gotten into an accident with another car. But when I checked my mirrors, there was nothing behind me. Nothing at all, not even those people. As if the situation wasn't already freaky enough, that made it so much worse. I wasn't waiting though. I sped off as fast as I was comfortable going with how heavy the fog was. By the time I hit the 101 interchange, I could actually see again, and for the first time, I felt my brain starting to relax. But the more I calmed down, the more I thought about what had happened. And this might sound surprising, but I genuinely concluded that I hallucinated everything. Here's the thing, I had been driving for almost 4 hours at that point. I was exhausted. I had been staring into fog for God knows how long, barely able to see anything, completely alone on a dark highway. So an extremely vivid hallucination didn't seem that far-fetched to me. Why it was so oddly specific was beyond me, but there was no other explanation for me having seen those people or having felt a wreck that didn't actually happen. By the time I made it home, I was just ready to sleep the whole thing off and try to forget about it. But then I walked around to the back of my car. The rear bumper was destroyed. There was a massive dent running almost the entire width of it, which meant whatever hit me had hit me way harder than I thought. It also meant that I actually had been hit, meaning I hadn't hallucinated anything. I stared at the dent for like 5 minutes. There wasn't any paint transfer, which there definitely would have been if I had been hit by another car. But if it wasn't another car that had hit me, I had no idea what could have caused such considerable damage. I did end up calling the cops to report what I saw, but it was more so just to get the info out there. I've thought about that night a lot over the past 4 years. I've gone through every possible explanation I could think of. What I've accepted is that I hallucinated the figures, and in my panicked attempt to drive off, I hit a guardrail post or a mile marker or something like that. The thing that gets me is this though. I can accept a hallucination, but for me to hallucinate one thing, the figures, while actually experiencing the other, the crash, is something I have trouble accepting. The fact that there was actually damage to my car has always made me think there was something more malicious going on that night. This happened this past spring break, so we're talking only a few weeks ago. I'm still in college, I'm a senior now, and I went back to my hometown for the week like I always do. The problem with going home, though, is that there's genuinely nothing to do there. I grew up in one of those suburban towns that's technically close to a city, but doesn't have any of the benefits of actually being in one. meaning no bars or nightlife or anything really within walking distance. When I'm at school, I've always got something going on, but back at home, it's a ghost town. The other issue is that none of my hometown friends had the same spring break schedule as me. I've got maybe 4 or 5 people I still keep in touch with from high school, and every single one of them was either still in class or already had their spring break earlier in March, so I was looking at a full week of doing nothing, which I really wasn't thrilled about. I should probably also mention that I've been trying to cut back on some stuff lately, nicotine and alcohol mainly. I figured a week at home with nothing to do was either going to make that worse or give me a chance to reset. I decided I was going to work out every single day instead. I was going to lift in the mornings and run in the afternoons, keep myself busy just so I could stay out of my own head. That's how I ended up going for a run on a random Tuesday afternoon. I remembered this loop I used to do back when I ran cross country in high school. It's exactly 3 miles from start to finish, starting and ending at my house. The route takes me through my neighborhood for maybe a quarter mile, then cuts into this wooded trail that winds through a small patch of forest before spitting you back out onto the street about a block from home. I've probably run that loop 1,000 times between freshman and senior year. The woods is the best part, honestly. Running on pavement destroys your knees, but the trail through the woods is soft. It's quiet in there too, which is something I always look for on my runs. So I headed out around 5. The sun wasn't going to set for another couple hours, so I wasn't worried about visibility. What I did notice though, and I noticed it the second I stepped outside, was the fog. I don't know how to describe it other than to say it was thick in a way I'd never seen before. I've lived in that town my whole life, and I don't remember fog like that. It looked fake almost, like I was in some ambient video game or one of those lo-fi YouTube videos with the anime girl studying. Everything past maybe 30 or 40 feet just dissolved into haze. I thought about skipping the run, but I talked myself out of it. The trail through the woods is a straight shot, one path with no forks or diverging paths. I've been through there so many times I could probably do it blindfolded. Getting lost wasn't even a possibility. I had my Garmin watch on so I could track my pace and distance. I started my workout, did the quarter mile through the neighborhood, and entered the woods. The fog was even thicker in there, which made sense since the trees blocked out a lot of the remaining daylight. I couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet ahead of me, but the trail is easy to follow. For the first mile and a half, everything was normal. I was running a little slower than usual because of the visibility, but it wasn't too bad. I remember checking my watch around the mile mark, then again at a mile and a half. The issue started around the 2.5 mile mark. At that point in the loop, I should have been approaching the end of the trail. The path curves to the left, you go up a small hill, and then you're out, back on pavement. I know that section by heart. Hell, I know every section by heart. I've literally run that loop hundreds of times. But when I looked down at my watch and saw 2.5 miles, I was still deep in the woods. I figured my watch was just being weird. It was at least 4 years old at that point, so I assumed its GPS signal was getting interrupted by the dense tree coverage or something. The fog could have been messing with it too. These seemed like reasonable enough explanations though, so I just kept running, assuming I wasn't as far along the trail as I thought. But then I passed 3 miles, which was when I knew something was up. 3 miles is the entire loop. At 3 miles, I should have been standing either in my driveway or on the street. Instead, I was still surrounded by trees on both sides, still running on the same dirt path with no indication that I was anywhere close to getting out. So I stopped. I'm not a paranoid person, and I'm not superstitious either. There must have been some rational explanation for what was going on. I caught my breath and tried to think, but I genuinely could not figure out what was going on. There was only one trail, which I knew for a fact. There weren't any forks, branches, or alternate paths. The only way I could have gotten lost in there was if I had physically left the path and waded through the brush and undergrowth, which I definitely hadn't done. I checked my watch again. 3.1 miles. The number kept ticking up even though I was standing still, which told me the GPS was definitely having issues. That was the only part of the whole thing that made any sense. I didn't really have a choice at that point. I could either keep running forward and hope I eventually hit the exit, or I could turn around and retrace my steps. The second option seemed smarter. If I just ran back the way I came, I'd eventually get to the trailhead where I started, and from there, I knew exactly how to get home. So that's what I did. I turned around and started running back. The fog had gotten worse. I didn't know how that was even possible, but it had. I had to slow my pace just to make sure I didn't run off the trail by accident. After about a mile of running, so about 4 total miles at that point, I heard something. Like I said earlier, it's usually dead quiet in the woods, which I suspect is the case because it's too small for a lot of animals to inhabit. So hearing a sound out there was something my brain wasn't prepared for, but the sound itself was so much worse. It was something I'd never heard before. The closest I can get to describing it is a moan, but that's not quite right. It was lower than a moan, more like a drone, and it fluctuated. It would swell up, then dip back down, then swell up again. Almost like a siren, but human. I can't overstate how wrong it sounded. It wasn't someone calling for help, and it didn't really sound like someone in pain either. It was just a sustained, wavering noise that didn't seem to have any purpose. I started running faster, but you have to remember that I had been running for over 4 miles at that point. I could only go so fast, and the exhaustion only made the situation that much more terrifying. Running faster only tired me out more, and the more tired I got, the more scared I got. The sound didn't stop no matter how fast I ran. Whoever or whatever was out there was matching my speed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, and I did multiple times, I couldn't see anything. There was just fog back there. I ran with the sound following me for what felt like forever. I had no other choice. It was the scariest moment of my life. After an eternity of running, I finally made it out of the woods. I ran into the street and nearly threw up out of exhaustion. The fog was still impossibly thick, even outside the woods. I turned around and looked back into the woods. To my horror, there was something standing right in the middle of the trail. Just a little ways beyond the trailhead. I say something because I don't know what else to call it. It was just a shape, this dark mass of a silhouette. It was way taller than me, and I'm 6'1". This thing had to be 7 feet tall at least. It wasn't moving closer or further away from me. It just watched me. I could feel it. If it weren't for the fact that it was gently swaying back and forth, I would have questioned whether I was looking at a tree or something. The droning sound had stopped, but I wasn't giving it another thought. I turned and ran home without looking back. That was a few weeks ago now. I'm back at school at this point, but I haven't been able to think about that night. I can't get that image of what I saw in the fog out of my head. That black mass and that god-awful sound. I told my parents about what I saw, obviously, and they both seemed convinced that it was just a tall person trying to scare me, or potentially attack me, which I guess is possible, but I don't believe that. How were they able to make that noise while running to keep up with me? Impossible. And how tall they were, too. I don't know what was in those woods that night, and I probably never will. This happened about 6 years ago, late September. My buddy Edwin and I had been talking about kayaking Willapa Bay for probably 2 years at that point, and we finally locked in a weekend to actually do it. If you're not familiar with the area, Willapa Bay is this massive tidal estuary on the Washington coast, something like 25 miles long. It's mostly oyster farms and wildlife refuge, and on a clear day, it's honestly one of the most peaceful places I've ever been. The weekend we picked was not a clear day. Neither of us were amateurs. We'd both been kayaking since we were kids, and Edwin actually worked as a guide for a few summers during college. We knew what we were doing. That's important context for what I'm about to tell you, because I don't want anyone thinking we were just a couple of idiots who got spooked because we didn't know how hot water and fog work. We launched early Saturday morning from a put-in spot near Nakota. The fog was really thick, but we figured it would burn off by mid-morning like it usually does on the coast. We had a GPS, a compass, and everything. The plan was to paddle out toward Long Island, maybe do some bird watching, have lunch on one of the sandbars, and head back before the afternoon tide shift. The first hour or so was fine. The fog muffled everything in that way coastal fog does. You feel like you're paddling through cotton and everything is really quiet. We couldn't see more than maybe 40 feet in any direction, but we were staying close together and checking our bearing every few minutes. No big deal. It was probably around 9 a.m. when I first heard something. It was a splashing sound. At first, I thought it was Edwin. We were paddling in loose tandem formation, him about 15 feet to my left, and I figured he just adjusted his stroke or something. but when I glanced over, his paddle was resting across his kayak. He asked if I heard that too, and I nodded my head yes. We both stopped paddling and just drifted there for a second, listening. It was the sound of oars, not paddles, which I say specifically because oars and paddles make distinct sounds. We were using paddles. You'd only use oars if you were on a different kind of boat, but it was definitely someone rowing a boat, and it didn't sound too far away from us either. Maybe 100 feet somewhere off to the right. Edwin said it was probably just someone else out there on the water, which seemed reasonable enough. There were other kayakers who used the bay, and occasionally you'd see fishermen in small boats checking crab pots. The fog was thick enough that we couldn't see them, but sound travels strangely over water, especially in fog. Sometimes things sound closer than they are, sometimes they sound further. We waited for a minute, expecting whoever it was to either call out or appear through the haze. Standard etiquette when visibility is low is to announce yourself and let other boaters know where you are, but the rowing just continued at the same steady pace. I suggested maybe they didn't know we were there, so Edwin said hello into the nothingness. But there was no response. In fact, whoever was in the other boat didn't even seem to notice, because the rowing sounds didn't speed up, slow down, or change at all. We started paddling again, figuring we'd either come across them or they'd pass by. But here's the thing, and I know this sounds paranoid, but over the next 20 minutes, that rowing sound never got any closer or further away. Hearing that same exact rhythm over and over again started getting intoxicating, and after a while, I was actually in awe of how perfectly someone could keep their stride for so long. But as time went past, I only got more and more freaked out. It was an unsettling situation, to say the least. Edwin and I really weren't talking much anymore, but I knew he felt the same way. At one point, we shifted our course slightly east, trying to angle toward the shore, and for a split second, the fog thinned out just enough for me to see a small rowboat sitting in the water. I could see the shape of someone at the oars, so I knew there was a person in it. But then the fog closed back in, and they were out of sight again. The whole glimpse lasted maybe 3 seconds. I asked Edwin if he'd seen it, and he said yes. At that point, I wanted to leave. Something about the whole situation was making me deeply uncomfortable, and I couldn't even fully articulate why. It's not like we'd seen anything threatening. It was just some guy rowing a boat, but the way he refused to identify himself or even acknowledge our presence, and the way he seemed to be following us, was just so creepy. I started heading for the shore, hoping Edwin would follow my lead, and he did. The problem was the fog. Even with the GPS, navigating the bay in low visibility isn't straightforward. There's sandbars that shift with the tides, shallow channels you can get stuck in, all sorts of nasty stuff. We knew roughly where we were, but roughly isn't the same as exactly, and the last thing we wanted was to beach ourselves on a mudflat while that other boat was still out there somewhere. We paddled southeast, moving as quickly as we could without exhausting ourselves. The rowing sound stayed with us the whole time. I kept glancing to my right, hoping to catch another glimpse through the fog, but I never did. And then, without any warning, the fog started to lift. It didn't clear completely, but it thinned enough that we could suddenly see maybe 100 yards in any direction. I immediately looked to my right, toward where the rowing sound had been coming from. There was nothing there. It was just open water. I looked behind us. Open water there too. I looked in every direction I could. I saw Edwin doing the same thing, but as far as we could tell, the bay was empty. I looked at Edwin and realized however freaked out I was, he was even more scared. I could see it in his eyes. We kept paddling, and even though the rowing sound had stopped and we could actually see now, the situation was a lot scarier. How could that boat have just disappeared like that? The shore came into view about 5 minutes later, and I was relieved. I thought the ordeal was finally over, but no. We paddled straight for land, not even bothering to look for a suitable landing spot. We hit the shallows, and I jumped out into knee-deep water. The water was cold as hell, but I barely noticed. I was just glad to be on solid ground again. For a minute or two, neither of us said anything. We just stood there on the beach catching our breath, looking out to the bay. The fog was still lifting, which was good, but there were still no boats anywhere out there. Edwin had wandered a little ways up the beach while I was securing my kayak. He told me to follow him, so I did. I realized he was looking at something, and I hurried to catch up to him, but the moment I noticed what he was looking at, I was terrified all over again. There were footsteps, wet, barefoot footsteps leading out of the water and up onto the sand. They were fresh, which was painfully obvious because you could see where water was still pooled in the depressions. Whoever made them had not been out of the water for long. But here's the thing. They didn't just lead up to the beach and stop. The prints came out of the water, walked a few feet up toward the tree line, and then turned and followed the shoreline to our left before eventually cutting back toward the trees and disappearing into the woods. I followed the path with my eyes, trying to trace it backward. The prints were coming from somewhere further down the shore. Whoever made them had seemingly walked up along the water's edge, come up onto the beach right where we'd landed, and then headed into the forest. Edwin was a few steps ahead of me. He said he wanted to leave, but I couldn't stop looking at the footprints. They were leading somewhere, or rather, they were coming from somewhere, and I wanted to know where. I told Edwin I wanted to follow them back, not into the trees, but the other direction. I wanted to see where they originated. He looked at me like I was out of my mind, which honestly, maybe I was, but something about this whole situation had been gnawing at me since we first heard those oars, and I wasn't ready to just paddle away without at least trying to understand what the hell was going on. Edwin didn't want to come back with me, but he also didn't want to stand there alone, so after about 30 seconds of back and forth, he reluctantly agreed. We started following those footprints down the shoreline. The fog still hadn't completely lifted, but the visibility was a lot better at that point. We walked for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, keeping the footprints to our left, and then I saw it. Maybe 50 yards down the beach, pulled up onto the sand at an angle, was a small wooden rowboat. The wood was dark, almost black, and the oars were resting inside it. It was the same boat, I was 100% certain of it. The shape, the color, the size, it was the exact same boat I'd seen through the fog when we were out on the water, and now it was here, on the shore, with a trail of wet footprints leading away from it. I started walking toward it instinctively, but Edwin grabbed my arm. He told me we were leaving, and he said he wasn't asking this time. He said he didn't care what was in the boat or who had been rowing it. We were done. Something about the way he said it took me from curious to downright terrified. Whoever had been in that boat had somehow gotten to shore before us, walked all the way down the beach to the exact spot where we had just happened to land, and then still had time to disappear into the trees. We turned around and started heading back toward the kayaks. Edwin was practically sprinting at that point, and seeing him run only freaked me out even more. We got to our kayaks, shoved them back into the water, and paddled out of there as fast as we could. And that was that. I've thought about that morning a lot over the past 6 years. I've gone through every possible explanation I could think of. The best case scenario is that we were just victims of some elaborate prank, but I think that's somewhat far-fetched. Here's what I keep coming back to. We were on the water for over 2 hours. We paddled in multiple directions, changed course several times, and eventually made a beeline for shore when the fog started lifting. Whoever was in that rowboat would have had to get to land before us, in a slower vessel no less, walk all the way down the shoreline to the exact spot where we ended up landing, and then disappear into the trees, all before we even hit the beach. It sounds so absurd and impossible that I honestly don't know what to think. So that's why after I send this, I'm gonna try not to think about it once again.